Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to settle into a warm blanket of time as we drift gently into the hushed, flickering world of medieval taverns, those humble yet surprising sanctuaries where ale flowed, secrets passed from lip to ear, and laughter echoed beneath heavy timber beams. This is not merely a tale of drink and song, but a long, winding path through the hidden corners of village inns and city alehouses, a soft unraveling of the lives, hopes, and quiet conspiracies that once gathered around fire-lit tables long ago. So close your eyes if you wish, and let your mind wander back to a time when the tavern door creaked open to welcome wanderers and villagers alike, each carrying burdens and dreams that might lighten with a cup in hand. In the hush of a dusky village, a lone traveler would see the glow first, a warm halo spilling from crooked windows, promising shelter from the night. Perhaps the air outside was sharp with rain or heavy with the frost of late autumn. A man or woman, boots muddied from the road, cloak drawn tight about the shoulders, would quicken their step toward that glow, feeling the promise of voices and warmth to come. The door, stout and rough-hewn, might groan as it opened, but within lay a world so different from the chill and dark without. Inside, the air was alive with the mingling scents of roasting meat, spilled ale, burning tallow candles, and the faint sweetness of straw strewn upon the floor. Rough oak beams ran across the low ceiling, dark with the smoke of countless hearth fires. Along the walls, benches crowded with villagers hunched close together, tankards clasped in cold hands, their eyes bright with the chance to forget life's weight, if only for an hour or two. Above the murmured talk, the barkeep's laughter would ring out, warm and practiced, as he slammed down mugs of ale and wiped froth from his beard. No two taverns were the same, though they shared a spirit that traveled from hamlet to hamlet, city to city. Some were no more than cottages turned alehouses. One or two rooms, a single hearth, a rough counter where the mistress of the house poured cider and weak wine into wooden cups. Others sprawled like living beasts of timber and stone, with stable yards for travelers' horses, cellars stocked with barrels that came rattling in on creaking wagons from distant brewers. These grander inns might offer a clean bed upstairs, or at least a straw pallet shared with strangers, a luxury compared to sleeping beneath hedgerows and cold stars. On any given night, the tavern was a living tapestry of souls. There might be a weary shepherd, coins jingling in his purse from a good lamb sale. Perhaps a wandering minstrel rested his lute upon a battered table, hoping the kindness of drinkers would fill his cup and his belly. A widow in plain wool might sit apart near the fire, eyes downcast yet ears keen, for even the humblest gossip could be spun into coin for those who knew where to sell secrets. And sometimes, though the village folk pretended not to see, a pair of cloaked men would lean too close in the shadowed corner, words hushed and eyes sharp, dealing in news not meant for common ears. The tavern keeper, always the quiet lord of this little realm, was more than a seller of ale. He was part judge, part confessor, part watchman over the hearts and sins that passed beneath his roof. He knew whose husband stayed too late, whose son gambled away his father's coin, whose tongue wagged too freely when drink unknotted it. In a world where parchment was costly and news traveled slow, the tavern keeper was a keeper of stories, both the ones told aloud and those better left unsaid. Yet the joy of the tavern did not lie only in the drink, nor even the warmth against the bitter wind. It was the hum of company, the shared mirth that flickered like candlelight. When a mug was lifted, it was not merely to wet the throat, but to soften life's edges, to remember that one was not alone in hardship, nor in hope. In the far corner, a low song might begin, one voice at first, cracked with age or youth, then another and another, until the beams themselves seemed to carry the tune aloft. Children, if they were lucky enough to be let in on a quiet evening, would doze curled on benches, lulled by the rumble of voices and the smell of roasted onions and fat. Outside, the night pressed close, whispering through the thatch and rattling the shutters. But within, the circle of warmth and light held strong. There were no clocks to mark the hours, only the slow burn of candles, the drip of wax upon the tables, and the steady drain of barrels tapped again and again. When at last the last jug was emptied and the last story told, the tavern door would swing wide once more to release its guests into the hush of dawn or the deep black of a waiting night. And so, night after night, year upon year, these unassuming houses of drink and firelight stitched themselves into the very fabric of medieval life. They were the pulse that kept communities beating through long winters and lean harvests, the hearth where strangers became friends or enemies or something in between. Tonight, we have only just stepped inside. Ahead lie many nights yet to unfold, and many secrets tucked away in the shadows, waiting to be found. So rest now, and let the embers burn low in your mind, for when next we gather, we shall follow the footsteps of the brewer and the cooper, and watch how a single mug of ale might shape the fate of a village, a wanderer, or a kingdom entire. The rain fell softly that next evening, drumming on the thatched roof of a small tavern nestled at the edge of a narrow village lane. By the time the first guests arrived, their cloaks were dark and heavy with damp, their boots leaving muddy prints upon the rushes spread fresh upon the floor. Within, the hearth crackled and spat, throwing shadows that danced among the beams like playful ghosts. The tavern keeper, a broad man named Oswin, stood behind his stout wooden counter, one eye on the door, the other on the barrels stacked neatly behind him. Oswin had been a brewer before he was a tavern keeper, and some said he still was, though the law in certain shires frowned upon a man selling his own brew without the blessing of lord or church. But such things were whispered only when the hearth's glow was low, and the ale had already loosened tongues. For now, Oswin's ale was the pride of the village, dark, nutty, with a warmth that settled in the belly and coaxed even the sternest farmer to linger for one more cup. Tonight, among the early guests was Aldith, a widow of middle years with a sharp nose for fresh gossip and a mind quick enough to remember every word. She settled herself by the fire, spreading her damp skirts to dry, her eyes flitting from newcomer to newcomer. Near her sat Wulfric, the cooper, whose broad hands shaped barrels so tight they barely leaked a drop, a skill that made him as welcome here as the ale itself. Without barrels, after all, the drink would spoil, and without drink, what use was a tavern at all? In a corner half lit by the hearth, a young boy swept the floor with a birch broom twice his height. He was Oswin's nephew, or so the tavern keeper claimed, though some said the boy's mother had been a barmaid once, and Oswin had taken him in when she'd run off with a passing soldier. The boy, whose name was Leof, worked quietly, ears wide for the tales and jests that drifted over him like smoke. Outside, the rain pattered steadily, but within, warmth and chatter rose with the steam of stew bubbling over the fire. On the hearth sat an iron pot, its lid rattling now and then as carrots, onions, and a hock of salted pork surrendered their flavors to the simmering broth. The smell drew in even the most reluctant soul, promising comfort that needed no words. At the far end of the room, two figures settled into a shadowed nook. One wore a faded green cloak, the other a patched jerkin of brown leather. They spoke in low tones, heads bent close, the flicker of candlelight catching the sharp glint of a silver ring upon the green-cloaked man's finger. Aldith's eyes flickered that way more than once, but she knew well enough to pretend she saw nothing. To listen without appearing to do so was an art as fine as brewing ale or shaping staves. Oswin wiped down his counter with a cloth that smelled faintly of yeast and smoke. He greeted each new guest by name. A farmer's son just old enough for his first cup, an old shepherd bent from years on the moors, a pair of weavers whose woolen cloaks dripped rain onto the floor. Coins clinked softly as mugs were filled, froth spilling over, caught on calloused hands and thirsty lips. Outside the village, on roads slick with mud, wagons creaked under the weight of barrels bound for other taverns and market stalls. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a brewer's apprentice hauled sacks of barley and hops through the chill, dreaming perhaps of someday standing behind a counter like Oswin's, master of his own hearth and brew. For in these days, a good brewer was more than a craftsman. He was a quiet power, able to make or break the fortunes of a tavern, and by extension, the spirits of a whole village. Back inside, the cooper Wulfric leaned closer to Oswin's counter, his voice low but carrying. "Barrels sprung at the back, Oswin. If I don't mend it by dawn, you'll be serving rainwater and swearing it's ale." Oswin grunted, pouring another measure into Wulfric's mug. "See to it, and there's a meal for your trouble," he rumbled. Wulfric nodded, savoring the brew before setting his mug aside and stepping out into the drizzle, a lantern swinging from his broad fist. Leof paused his sweeping to watch Wulfric disappear through the door, the boy's eyes wide with quiet wonder at the cooper's easy strength. He imagined himself, someday, shaping wood into staves so snug no drop could escape, a craft that made a boy useful, respected, never left wanting for a roof or a warm place by the fire. Meanwhile, the whispers in the corner thickened like the stew upon the hearth. The green-cloaked man leaned closer to his companion, voice now a hiss. Something about the new tax, the Reeves' greed, and a name spoken too soft to catch. Aldith shifted, tilting her ear just so, but the hiss of the rain on the shutters masked the words that mattered most. At a table near the door, the young farmer's son laughed too loudly at a joke he didn't quite understand, his cheeks flushed with the boldness that only ale could lend. The old shepherd smiled at him, eyes crinkling in the firelight, for he had seen 3 generations come into this world and grow bold in this very room, only to grow old beside the same hearth. As the night deepened, the voices rose and fell, cups drained and filled again, and the tavern pulsed like a heart against the darkness beyond. For here, within these beams and shadows, every life touched another, if only for a fleeting hour. The brewer's barrel, the cooper's skill, the boy's broom, the widow's listening ear, the stranger's quiet bargain struck behind cupped hands. When the last mug was drained and the stew pot scraped clean, Oswin would snuff the candles one by one, his broad hand gentle as it pinched each flame. Outside, the rain might yet fall, the roads run with mud, the cold creep beneath cottage doors. But here, beneath the tavern's roof, warmth lingered in the bones of the walls, and secrets nestled into corners, waiting to stir again when next the door swung wide to welcome the world within. Long after the last guest had stumbled homeward through the softened hush of the rain, the tavern lay quiet but not wholly still. In the amber glow of the hearth's dying coals, Oswin moved with surprising care for a man of his bulk. He cleared the mugs left behind, some upright, some toppled like soldiers felled after a lost skirmish, and stacked them near the wash basin. His heavy boots creaked upon the rushes as he bent to poke at the coals, ensuring no stray ember would spark mischief once sleep claimed him. Leof, the boy with the broom, sat cross-legged on a low bench by the hearth. In his lap lay a battered wooden cup, half full with the last dregs of watered ale Oswin had quietly poured for him, a silent reward for sweeping the floor until every straw lay straight. He sipped it slowly, careful not to cough at the bitter taste. To him, that thin ale tasted of grown men's secrets and the promise that one day he might stand behind that counter too. "Go on then," Oswin rumbled, his voice like a bear's yawn in the dark. "Off to your mat, lad. You'll not see dawn if you doze by the coals." Leof nodded, clutching the empty cup to his chest as he scurried toward the small loft above the main room. There, beneath a worn blanket, he lay on a pallet of straw and sackcloth, the warmth of the hearth still glowing behind his eyelids as sleep pulled him under. But Oswin did not yet sleep. He lingered at the counter, staring at the barrels lined up like silent sentinels along the back wall. One, the cooper's barrel, still leaked a thin, dark trail that pooled on the stone floor. He pressed a thick finger to the crack, feeling the slow, patient drip of ale that would be missed come morning. He grunted to himself. Wulfric would see to it, but the loss stung all the same, a reminder that every drop meant coin, and every coin meant more barley, more hops, more reason for folk to gather under his roof instead of another's. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and with it came footsteps, not the stumbling gait of a drunkard, but a measured tread, careful not to splash the puddles that gathered beneath the eaves. Oswin's brow creased. Few honest souls had reason to call at this hour. He moved to the door, lifting the iron latch with a click that echoed like a small hammer in the hush. On the threshold stood a man wrapped in a hooded cloak, the edges beaded with rain. Beneath the hood, the glint of a silver ring caught the glow of the coals. The same ring Aldith's sharp eyes had marked hours before. The stranger stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, slipping past Oswin as if he belonged there. "Closed," Oswin growled, shutting the door against the night's chill. The man merely smiled, lowering his hood to reveal a narrow face, clean-shaven but for a shadow of stubble, and eyes that never quite rested in one place. Not for me, I think, the stranger said softly. His voice was smooth, with a lilt that spoke of towns larger than this village lane. He reached into his cloak and placed a small purse upon the counter. The faint clink of coin was muffled, but it filled the room like a trumpet's call. Oswin did not reach for the purse. He crossed his arms instead, waiting. He had played this game before, not often, but enough to know when a man's coin carried the weight of things best left unspoken. The stranger eased himself onto a stool, careful to avoid the puddle of ale still creeping from the cracked barrel. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter, close enough for Oswin to catch the faint smell of travel, wet wool, horse sweat, and the iron tang of road dust. I'll not stay long, the man said. I seek someone, a name I heard whispered in your house tonight. Oswin's eyes narrowed. He did not flinch, nor glance at the loft above where Leof lay dreaming. Names are for prayers and tombstones, he said at last. I sell ale, not secrets. The stranger's smile never wavered. He nudged the purse closer, its weight creasing the worn wood of the counter. Then sell me a cup, innkeep, and if a name should come with it, well, all the better for us both. Oswin said nothing, but he reached for a clean mug and dipped it into the barrel that did not leak. The good barrel, the one he trusted. He set the mug before the man, who lifted it and sniffed the froth with a connoisseur's care. He did not drink, not yet. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if the mug were a candle casting shadows that might reveal hidden truths. Word has it a rider passed through last week, the stranger murmured. Tall, broad, with a cloak lined in fox fur, paid with a silver mark stamped from the mint at Winchester. Said he was bound for the coast. I believe he stopped here. Perhaps he left a word or two behind. Oswin busied himself wiping down the counter with the same cloth he'd used all night. Many pass through. Few leave anything but crumbs and cold ashes. The stranger took a sip at last, then set the mug down so gently it barely touched the wood. His eyes met Oswin's, calm but sharp. They say you keep good ale and better memories. Oswin's broad shoulders shifted, a shrug that could mean anything. He turned, pretending to check the barrels again, his back to the man whose questions smelled of trouble and coin in equal measure. In the loft above, Leof stirred. Even in sleep, the low murmur of voices drifted through the boards, finding the boy's dreaming ear. He dreamed of fox fur cloaks and silver coins, of roads that led to places where secrets bought more than ale and warmth. Below, Oswin faced the stranger once more. He did not touch the purse, but neither did he push it away. The coals in the hearth settled with a soft sigh, their glow painting the walls in slow, breathing shadows. Somewhere beyond the shuttered windows, dawn was a rumor waiting for the sun to confirm it. For now, the tavern held its secrets close, the spill of ale upon stone, the whispered names hidden in mugs half drained, and the soft promise that come morning, all would be washed away in the clatter of new cups and new stories. The man in the cloak took another sip, his eyes glinting like the silver ring upon his hand, and Oswin waited, patient as the beams that held his house upright, ready to barter warmth for words if the price was right and the night long enough to hold them both. By dawn's gentle creep beneath the shutters, the stranger had gone, leaving behind the faintest trace of wet earth where his boots had rested, and the purse of coins that now lay heavy in Oswin's hand. The tavern keeper turned the pouch over once, twice, feeling the clink and weight of silver against his broad palm. He did not smile, nor did he sigh. He merely tucked it beneath a loose plank behind the counter, a place he alone knew, then set about the quiet labor of mourning. Above him, Leof stirred on his palate. The boy's dreams had ebbed away with the last embers, replaced now by the muted sounds of a new day. The hearth swept clean of ash, the iron pot scrubbed for another round of stew, the faint rattle of Oswin's key ring as he checked the storeroom behind the taproom. Leof lay still a moment longer, savoring that soft borderland between sleep and waking, where all things seemed possible. The road to the coast, the fox fur cloak, the promise of silver slipped across a worn counter. When at last he rose and padded down the creaking loft stairs, he found Oswin at the hearth, coaxing fresh flame from last night's coals. The smell of wood smoke filled the room, blending with the faint tang of yeast and old ale that lived forever in the tavern's beams. "Morning, uncle," Leof murmured, though they both knew the word was more habit than truth. Oswin grunted without turning. Fetch water from the well. And mind you, don't spill half of it on your boots this time. Leof ducked his head, pulling on his threadbare cloak before slipping out into the gray hush of dawn. The village lane was soft with mud, the rain's memory lingering in puddles that mirrored the pale sky. He passed the cooper's shed, where Wulfric's hammer already rang slow and steady against the staves of a half-finished barrel. The smell of wet wood and iron nails drifted from the open door. Wulfric glanced up as Leof passed. "Mind your step, boy," he called, voice warm but worn with sleep. "Your uncle'll skin me if you drown yourself in the well." Leof only smiled, dipping his head in shy greeting. He liked Wulfric. The cooper had once carved him a whistle from a scrap of oak, a small gift tucked into Leof's ragged blanket, hidden from Oswin's sharp eyes. At the well, the boy lowered the bucket, the rope rasping against damp wood. As the pail broke the surface, he paused, listening to the village waking around him. A cock crowed somewhere behind a hedge. Hooves clopped on distant cobbles where a farmer led his cart to market. Somewhere, a woman's voice called a child's name, soft but firm in the hush. When he returned, the tavern was awake in that quiet, careful way of early morning. The hearth snapped with new flames. Oswin leaned against the counter, counting coins from a battered wooden box, far less than the purse the stranger had left, yet enough to keep the barrels full and the benches warm for another week. Leof set the bucket by the hearth and crouched to stir the ashes again, feeding twigs and small logs until the warmth spread. The first guest of the day arrived before the sun was high, a peddler with a back hunched from years bent beneath the weight of his pack. He tapped at the door before pushing it open as though afraid to wake the ghosts of last night's laughter. "Got coin for cider?" he asked, voice dry as the dust in his beard. Oswin poured without question, filling a battered tin cup. The peddler paid in pennies, 3 copper coins, warm from his fist, and settled on a bench near the fire, letting the steam from his drink thaw the chill from his bones. He was soon joined by a pair of thatchers, their hands calloused and faces browned by years spent atop cottage roofs. They brought news with them, as all villagers did. A calf-born breech up by the miller's pasture, a shepherd's boy lost in the woods overnight, a Reeves man seen riding the old Roman road with a parchment case strapped to his saddle. Oswin listened without seeming to, his hands never still, wiping mugs, topping off cups, weighing each word for the thread of truth beneath the chatter. Leof listened too, though he tried to hide it behind the sweep of his broom. He learned more here than any school could teach. Which neighbor owed coin to whom? Which farm would need strong backs for harvest? Whose tongue grew reckless when drink softened its bridle? When the sun climbed higher, Aldith slipped in, skirts gathered against the mud. She perched beside the peddler, greeting him by name, though they had not seen each other in years. "Sold all your ribbons and pins in the next shire, have you?" she teased, accepting the mug Oswin placed before her. "Near enough," the peddler replied, scratching at the whiskers beneath his chin. "But I've tales worth more than ribbons, if you've ears to hear." Aldith smiled, showing the gap where a tooth had gone missing some winters back. "I always have ears for a good tale." So he spun it for her, and for the room, though his voice was low. Of a coach bogged in the mire 2 villages hence, its wheels sunk to the axle. Of a merchant's wife caught fleeing in the night with a cask of her husband's coin hidden beneath her skirts. Of a band of riders, cloaked and armed, seen by moonlight near the old abbey ruins. At that, Oswin's eyes flicked up. A single heartbeat, a moment's wait, then returned to the mugs he was washing. Leof caught it, though. He tucked it away beside the stranger's silver ring and the purse beneath the plank. The world beyond their little lane seemed closer every day, pressing its secrets against the tavern's walls like a cold hand at the window. Outside, the sky brightened, the village stirring fully to life. But within these beams and shadows, the tavern remained its own kingdom, a place where men and women shed their burdens for a cup and a story, where secrets passed from tongue to ear as softly as the morning wind slipping through the thatch. And all the while, Oswin watched. He heard. He remembered. For in a world where parchment was dearer than bread, the keeper of a tavern's hearth was also the keeper of its truths. And not all coins paid for ale alone. As the sun rose higher, Its pale warmth spilling over the village roofs, the tavern eased into its quieter hours, that gentle stretch between the first cups of dawn and the bustling rush of midday trade. Outside, the lane grew busy with carts creaking toward the market square. The clop of hooves and the low murmur of bargaining voices drifted through the tavern's shuttered windows, mingling with the muted crackle of the hearth. Inside, Aldith lingered by the fire, turning the peddler's tale over in her mind like a smooth pebble in her palm. She stirred her cider absently with a finger, her eyes half closed, as though listening to secrets only she could hear. From time to time, she would glance at Oswin, who moved steadily about his work with that same heavy grace, a man who heard far more than he ever spoke. Leof crouched near the hearth, scrubbing soot from the iron pot. Though his hands were busy, his ears were not idle. He caught the hush of Aldith's voice as she leaned closer to the peddler, pressing him for scraps of detail. What banners did the riders bear? How many were they? Did they carry spears or swords? The peddler, for his part, drew out each answer like a miser counting coins, savoring the weight of each word before handing it over. Now and then, the tavern door swung open to admit a wisp of warm air and a new face, a milkmaid with a jug balanced on her hip, a mason's apprentice dusty with lime, an old man with a crooked staff who paused just inside to sniff the hearth's welcoming smoke. Some stayed for a cup, others for a word, a warm nod, a bit of news traded for a sip of cider. Each departure left behind a trail of stories that settled into the beams and rushes like the scent of spilled ale. By mid-morning, Oswin's broad shadow loomed over Leof as the boys scrubbed. "Enough of that," the tavern keeper said gruffly, though his tone was not unkind. "Go fetch the salt pork from the shed. The Thatchers will want meat with their ale come midday." Leof wiped his hands on his tunic and slipped out the back door, blinking at the sharp light. The air outside smelled of wet earth and fresh thatch, the honest work of the village breathing around him like a living thing. He crossed the yard to the small stone shed that leaned against the tavern's rear wall, its roof patched with moss and weathered boards. Inside, the cool gloom wrapped him like a cloak. Strings of onions and bunches of drying herbs hung from the rafters, brushing his hair as he ducked beneath them. Against the far wall, salted pork sat stacked on rough shelves, its brine-heavy scent sharp in the close air. He cut a slab with care, wrapping it in a square of coarse cloth, then paused a moment to listen. Not for footsteps, but for the hum of his own thoughts. He wondered about the stranger with the silver ring, about the riders cloaked in moonlight, about the way Oswin's eyes flickered when certain words were spoken. He wondered what it might mean, for the village, for the tavern, for a boy with no father and a name that did not quite belong to him. When he returned, he found the tavern a shade busier. The Thatchers had come in, their boots dusty with straw and mud, their laughter already bubbling up like a song half remembered. They clapped Leof on the shoulder as he passed, one of them tugging playfully at the cloth bundle until the boy grinned and twisted away. Oswin carved the pork with the ease of long practice, thick slices that landed with a soft thud upon the trenchers set out along the counter. He poured ale with his other hand, never spilling a drop, never missing a word tossed his way. Bits of gossip fluttered through the air like drifting feathers. The Reeve's son caught poaching trout from the miller's pond. A midwife's cart stuck axle deep in a rutted lane. Talk of a fair to come at the harvest's end. In the midst of this hum, Wulfric the cooper returned, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He shook the last clinging droplets from his cloak and planted himself at the counter with a grunt of greeting. Oswin slid a mug toward him without asking. The two men shared a wordless nod, an old understanding that needed no more than that. "Barrels mended," Wulfric said at last, after a swallow of ale. "Good oak plug, tight as the church chest, won't see a leak again this winter." "Good," Oswin rumbled. He passed a fresh trencher of pork across the counter. "You'll eat." Wulfric accepted without fuss, tearing off a strip of meat with his teeth. Between bites, he cast a glance at Aldith, who was now deep in talk with the Thatchers, her eyes bright, her laughter edged with curiosity. Wulfric leaned closer to Oswin. "She's digging at that stranger's business, you know." Oswin did not look up from the mug he polished. "She's always digging." "Best watch her tongue," Wulfric murmured. Some secrets aren't meant for firelight and ale. Oswin's eyes lifted then, calm and dark. And some secrets are the only thing that keep a roof over our heads. Wulfric grunted, finishing his ale in a single pull. He set the mug down gently, as though not to wake the house's sleeping ghosts, just so long as they don't bring trouble to your door. Outside, the sun climbed higher, chasing off the last tatters of morning mist. The village buzzed with the restless stir of market day, the clatter of hooves, the rustle of coin, the sharp bark of barter and haggling. Yet within the tavern, the world seemed to flow slower, softer. A hush beneath the roar, where truths and lies traded places in the flicker of the hearth's flame. And amid it all, Leof moved like a shadow, listening. He tucked away every word, every glance, every careful silence. For a boy like him, the tavern was more than walls and ale. It was a map of secrets, a promise that even the smallest voice might one day carry the name worth remembering. The hours passed gently, as they always did when the tavern's hum settled into its midday calm. By now, the Thatchers had finished their trenchers of pork and were deep in their second mugs, voices growing louder with each fresh pour. The peddler, his purse a little heavier with trinkets sold in the lane, leaned back against the wall, half dozing, a thin thread of cider warming his old bones. Aldith, having gathered her scraps of rumor, had drifted to the far end of the counter, her hands folded primly as though they hid all she knew. Oswin wiped his blade on a scrap of cloth, his thick fingers careful as he wrapped the last slivers of pork in fresh linen. The hearth's heat pressed at his back, mingling with the yeasty breath of the barrels behind him. His mind wandered as he worked, not to the weight of the purse hidden beneath the plank, nor the hush of the stranger's questions, but to more ordinary burdens. The next barrel to tap, the next sack of barley to order, the roof beam near the back door that would soon need mending before the winter winds began to claw at the thatch. At the far table, Leof crouched on the floor, gathering up the scraps the Thatchers had dropped. A crust of bread here, a strip of rind there, a splintered bone sucked clean of its marrow. He tucked these bits away in a small cloth sack tied at his belt, careful to hide it when Oswin's gaze swept the room. Tonight, when the hearth burned low and the tavern's bellies were full, Leof would slip a bit of meat to the old hound that sometimes lingered by the shed, a creature as lean and restless as the boy himself. Near the window, a shaft of sun fell through a crack in the shutter, striking dust motes into a soft golden swirl. In that gentle light, the tavern felt almost like a church, its wooden beams a kind of timbered naves, its low murmur of voices a prayer that no one spoke aloud. Here, men and women shed their burdens for a moment, set aside the day's harsh truths in exchange for warmth, for a belly half full, for the promise that tomorrow might be kinder. But outside, the world pressed close. On the lane beyond the door, wheels rattled over the ruts left by the night's rain. A rider passed at a slow trot, his cloak drawn tight against the lingering damp, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He did not pause, did not look toward the tavern, yet the Thatchers fell quiet as his shadow slipped across the window's smear of light. When he was gone, their talk resumed, softer now. Laughter forced, mugs lifted to hide the unease that had settled in his wake. Aldith noticed it too. She leaned toward the Thatchers, her words dropping like pebbles into a still pond. A Reeves man, do you think? Or worse, a tax collector sniffing for coin? One of the Thatchers, a broad-shouldered fellow named Edric, snorted into his ale. Doesn't matter to us, long as he keeps riding. Coin's better spent on drink than on the Reeves pouch. But even Edric's boast could not lift the hush that lingered after the rider's passing. Wulfric, still perched on his stool by the counter, drummed his thick fingers on the wood. His eyes met Oswin's for a breath, the unspoken thought flickering between them, like the flame that danced on the hearth's logs. Strangers came and went. That was the way of things. But too many strangers asking too many questions could sour a village faster than spoiled ale. When the sun tipped past its highest mark, the Thatchers rose at last, paying their coin in clinking coppers and crude jests. They stumbled out into the lane, their laughter echoing off the low cottages and the stone wall that marked the village's edge. The peddler, roused by their noise, muttered his goodbyes and shouldered his pack once more, the little brass bells sewn to his straps jingling faintly as he disappeared down the lane. Aldith lingered longest. She stood by the counter, watching Oswin as he poured off the dregs from a barrel nearly spent. Her eyes, dark and sharp, traced every move of his thick hands. "You've a full house these days," she said softly. "More coin than you used to see, and more ears pricked for whispers that don't belong to the common folk." Oswin did not look up. He thumped the empty barrel once, a sound like a drumbeat in the quiet room. "People talk," he said simply. "It's what keeps my hearth warm." Aldith smiled, showing that familiar gap between her teeth. "And what keeps it dangerous, too." Leof, who had returned to his sweeping, paused just long enough to hear her words. He glanced at Oswin, but the man's face was carved from stone, his eyes fixed on the next barrel waiting to be tapped. Outside, the sky shifted from silver to pale blue. The breeze that slipped through the door's crack carried the scent of earth and distant fields, a reminder that harvest time drew closer each day. With harvest came laborers seeking beds and ale, merchants seeking new bargains, travelers passing through on roads that twisted out beyond the village and into places Leof could only imagine. The boy let his broom rest for a moment, leaning it against the hearth. He peered out the window, the lane bright now in the mid-afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, the stranger with the silver ring rode on, perhaps following that cloaked figure who had passed so quietly, whose shadow lingered still in the hush of the room. Behind him, Oswin lifted the fresh barrel onto its cradle, the heavy thud of wood on wood echoing like a promise. Aldith slipped out then, her skirts brushing the rushes, her eyes bright with thoughts she would carry from doorstep to doorstep before the day was through. And the tavern, once more, breathed in the hush that settled between secrets and stories, between the warmth of the hearth and the chill waiting just beyond the door. In that hush, Leof stood very still, a boy with a broom and a head full of questions, and the faintest sense that the life of this tavern, his tavern, was about to change in ways he could not yet name. By late afternoon, the sun slanted low behind the thatched roofs, casting long shadows that crept like watchful cats across the village lane. The hush that had held the tavern in its gentle grip began to stir again, as it always did when the day's labor neared its end, and folk sought warmth, company, and a cup to ease the ache of honest toil. Leof had finished his sweeping and now perched on the low stool near the hearth, turning a small scrap of wood in his hands. It was nothing more than an offcut from Wulfric's workshop, a shaving of oak left behind when the cooper mended Oswin's leaking barrel. Yet in Leof's nimble fingers, the wood became a promise, a carved token, perhaps a whistle like the one Wulfric had given him years ago, or a small figure to guard beneath his pallet when the night pressed too close. He worked the shape with his small knife, careful not to draw Oswin's attention. The tavern keeper tolerated many things, a half-finished chore, a boy's silent listening, but idle hands made him frown. So Leof's hands stayed busy, though his ears stayed busier still. Through the door came the miller's sons first, their boots powdered with fine white dust, their laughter loud as they pushed each other toward the counter. Oswin greeted them with a nod and 2 sturdy mugs, filling each with ale pulled fresh from the barrel Wulfric's hands had sealed so tight. The boys dropped copper pennies on the counter, half tossed, half spun, their pockets fat from a good week's toll on the village grain. Next came the old widow, Maud, leaning on her cane as she picked her way across the rushes. Her eyes were sharp despite the stoop in her back, and when she lowered herself onto her usual bench by the hearth, she nodded once at Leof, who dipped his head in shy reply. She never asked for ale. She had no coin for it. But Oswin always set a small mug of warm cider by her elbow all the same. Some said it was out of pity. Others said it was because she alone remembered when Oswin's father stood behind the same counter, pouring rough cider for soldiers bound for wars that no one spoke of now. As the sky turned from gold to the bruised blue of early dusk, the tavern filled, the hum growing like a slow tide. A carpenter's apprentice came in, his hands nicked with splinters, his purse as light as his step. A pair of charcoal burners found a corner near the door, their faces still smudged with soot despite the cold wash they'd splashed at the village pump. A traveling merchant, stranger to most, but familiar enough to Oswin to earn a nod of welcome, eased his weary bones onto a bench by the back wall. He carried no heavy wares, only a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, set down beside his foot where he could feel its weight even as he drank. Stories bloomed with each cup poured. The miller's sons boasted of a new wheel to be fitted come spring, stronger and faster than the old one that creaked and groaned at the mill race. The charcoal burners grumbled about the Reeves taxman sniffing around their piles, counting each cartload of black gold as if every splinter owed a tithe. The carpenter's apprentice spun tales of a new hall being raised at the edge of the next village. Oak beams so wide, 3 men together could not encircle one. And all the while, Oswin moved among them, filling mugs, passing trencher and cup, nodding where a nod was needed, silence where silence kept the peace. His eyes flicked now and then to the merchant by the back wall, to the oilcloth bundle, to the restless shifting of the man's boots. Something carried on that man's shoulders did not sit easy, though no word yet named it. Near the hearth, Maud spoke softly to Leof, while the grown men laughed and argued over who owed whom a penny from last year's bet. "Mind your eyes, boy," she rasped, her voice cracked with years. "Folk bring more than thirst to these walls. Some bring burdens they mean to leave behind. Some bring trouble that drinks its fill and leaves you paying after." Leof did not know what to say to that. He only turned his scrap of wood over in his fingers, the half-carved shape now showing the faint curve of a bird's wing. "I watch," he whispered back, so quiet even Maud had to lean close to catch it. "I," she said, her pale eyes gleaming in the hearth's glow. "You watch, and you remember. It'll serve you when no man's coin will." A sudden bark of laughter broke their hush. The miller's eldest son, brash and rosy-cheeked, pounding the table as his brother spun a tale of a fox caught stealing grain. The sound rolled through the rafters, echoing in the beams, stirring the shadows that gathered in the corners as dusk bled into true night. Outside, a wind rose, soft but steady, rattling the shutter that hung crooked near the door. Oswin stepped to it, pressing the latch firm, his eyes lingering a moment on the darkness beyond. In that darkness lay the narrow lane, the silent fields, the tangled woods that wrapped the village like a sleeping beast. Beyond that, the road that carried riders and peddlers, secrets and whispers, and perhaps even the stranger whose silver ring still glinted in Leof's dreams. Back at the counter, the merchant shifted at last. He unwrapped the oilcloth just enough to reveal the corner of a carved box, small, polished, fitted with a brass latch that glowed like a coin caught in firelight. No one else seemed to notice, but Oswin did. So did Leof, though he kept his eyes down, carving the wing of his wooden bird a little finer, a little sharper. When the merchant caught Oswin's gaze, he lifted his mug in a silent toast. Oswin returned it with a slow nod, neither smile nor frown upon his face. In that small exchange, something passed between them, a promise or a bargain, tucked among the hum of voices and the scent of roasting onions drifting from the hearth. Night settled in, wrapping the tavern in its gentle hush once more. The ale flowed, the stories spun, the secrets sank deeper into the rushes beneath worn boots. And above it all, Leof watched. The boy with the broom and the half-made bird, carving his place in a world that shifted and whispered with every creak of the tavern's beams. As the night deepened, the warmth of the hearth grew more precious, for beyond the tavern's stout walls, the wind had risen to a low, restless moan. It slipped beneath doors, rattled the shutter Oswin had latched, and carried with it the damp scent of distant rain, though no drops yet fell upon the thatch. Inside, the gathered voices rose and fell like the tide. Laughter here, a muttered argument there, the clink of mugs lifted and set down in steady rhythm. Oswin stood behind his counter as he always did, a steady figure amid the flow of men and women drifting in and out of his domain. Now and then he paused to lean on the oak plank, broad arms folded across his chest as his eyes moved from face to face, catching each small exchange. A whispered word too soft for honest ears, a coin slipped palm to palm beneath the table, the quick, nervous glance of the merchant as he sipped at his ale, one hand forever resting on the brass-latched box at his side. Leof sat cross-legged near the hearth, his carving finished now, a tiny bird with wings outstretched, its beak lifted as if to taste the smoke that curled toward the beams. He turned it over in his palms, feeling the smoothness where the knife had worried away every splinter. Maud, half dozing on her bench, opened one bleary eye to watch him. Fine work, that, she rasped, her voice no more than a wind-dried reed. Will you sell it, boy, when it's done? Leof glanced at her, his dark hair falling over one brow. Who would pay for a wooden bird? Maud's chuckle rattled in her throat. Someone always pays. Not in coin, perhaps, but in something dearer. Mark me. He tucked the bird into the fold of his tunic all the same, safe beside the scraps of bread he had saved for the old hound. The warmth of it steadied him, an anchor in the drifting sea of voices and secrets that seemed to swell each night. The stranger's shadow lingered in memory. Across the room, the merchant at last eased the box fully into the firelight. The brass latch gleamed bright against the dull glow of the hearth. One of the charcoal burners noticed, lifting his chin to squint at the fine polish. What's that, then? He asked, voice thick with ale and curiosity. The merchant's fingers drummed once on the lid before stilling. He offered a smile, thin as a knife's edge. A keepsake, he said lightly. No more than a bauble for trade. The burner snorted, glancing at his companion. Odd trade for a man without a stall. The merchant only sipped his ale again, his eyes flicking to Oswin, a look that asked for no help and offered none. Oswin raised one brow, but he did not interfere. He had learned long ago that a tavern keeper's worth lay in when he chose to listen and when he chose to look away. Near the door, the latch rattled as a fresh gust of wind pressed at it. But this time, it was not only the wind that sought entry. The door swung wide with a groan, letting in a blast of chill air and a figure hunched in a cloak, rain dripping from the hem. The murmured voices faltered. A stranger, though not the one of the silver ring. This man was older, broader of shoulder, the weight of years and road dust settled upon him like an unseen mantle. He paused on the threshold, water puddling around his boots. His eyes, sharp beneath a furrowed brow, swept the room in one slow arc before settling on Oswin. The tavern keeper gave no greeting at first. He merely inclined his head, a silent measure of welcome and wariness both. Evening, the stranger rumbled, his voice rough with the road. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a careful hand. Ale? And something warm, if you've a mind. Oswin reached for a clean mug, the sound of the barrel's tap a steady answer to the hush that had gathered in the wake of the man's entrance. Stew's near ready, he said. Sit yourself. The stranger took a bench near the hearth, close enough that the steam rising from the pot brushed his travel-chapped face. Leof watched him over the curve of his knees, the carved bird pressed tight to his ribs. Something about the man's posture, the way his eyes never quite settled, the way his shoulders seemed to carry more than the simple burden of a cloak, tugged at the boy's sense for stories that did not fit the surface of things. Oswin set the ale down before the newcomer, then ladled a portion of stew into a wooden bowl, thick with turnip, onion, and the last shreds of the salt pork Leof had fetched that morning. The man took the bowl in both hands, breathing in the steam before lifting his mug for a slow swallow. His eyes, sharp and gray as flint, drifted once to the merchant and his brass-latched box. They lingered there only a heartbeat, but Leof saw it, the flicker of recognition, the calculation behind the calm. The old hound scratched at the tavern's rear door just then, a faint whine rising above the hum of voices. Leof slipped from his stool to answer, easing the latch so the creature could slink inside. The dog's ribs showed through its patchy coat, but its tail thumped once in thanks when Leof dropped the hidden scraps at its feet. It curled near Maud's bench, content to doze away the hours in the hearth's glow. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again, a soft warning that the night would grow colder still. Within these stout walls, warmth and secrets wove together like threads in a loom. The merchant sipped at his ale, his fingers tight upon the box. The stranger hunched over his stew, eyes watchful beneath the brim of his hood. And somewhere in the hush that bound them all, Leo felt a truth he could not name yet, that the life of a tavern was not only drink and song, but the quiet gathering of small storms, the brewing of tales that might, one day, break like thunder on their humble roof. The wind outside rose and fell like a slow breath, rattling the tavern's timbers as the hush within grew thicker. The stranger's presence near the hearth seemed to draw the warmth into a tight circle around him. A flickering pocket of firelight and steam from his bowl, the clink of his spoon as he scooped up onion and pork, the low rumble of his breath as he ate with the measured care of a man who had known too many nights without a hearth to call his own. Across the room, the merchant shifted on his bench. The brass-latched box stayed tucked beneath his boot, half concealed by his cloak's edge. His eyes flickered up now and then, glancing toward the stranger by the hearth, then darting away when those sharp flint-gray eyes returned the look. Between them stretched an invisible thread, thin but taut, humming with a tension that even the warm rumble of tavern talk could not drown. Leah felt it too, though he could not name it. He crouched by the old hound, scratching behind its ragged ear as the creature shivered off the cold that still clung to its bones. Maud's cane tapped the floor softly as she rose with a grunt, easing herself closer to the hearth's warmth. "Too many shadows tonight," she murmured to no one in particular, but her eyes settled on Leof. "Keep your ears open, boy." Oswin heard her too. He set down the mug he'd been wiping and gave the old woman a slow nod. He knew better than most that Maud's mutterings, cracked as her voice might be, often carried the weight of truths hidden in plain sight. The stranger pushed his empty bowl forward, wiping the rim clean with the back of his sleeve. He lifted his mug for another swallow, then leaned back, the bench creaking under his bulk. When he spoke, it was to Oswin, but the whole room tilted its ears closer. "Long road from the marshes," he said, his voice rough and low. "Road's quiet, but the woods ain't. Saw signs near the old abbey ruins. Hoofprints, fire pit, still warm." Oswin grunted, as if the words meant less than they did. Outlaws, maybe, or some farmer's boys run off from the Reeves levee. The stranger's eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade edge. Farm boys don't wear steel spurs and leave boot tracks like soldiers, nor do they light 3 fires in a ring. He reached into his cloak and drew out a scrap of cloth. Dark, mud-streaked, but even in the shifting hearth glow, the faint threads of embroidery glimmered silver. A murmur ran through the room, soft but quick, like a breeze stirring dry leaves. The merchant stiffened where he sat, hand pressing tighter over his box. Even the charcoal burners leaned forward, all pretense of drowsy drink gone. Oswin studied the cloth without reaching for it. His face showed little, only the faint tightening around his eyes, the deepening of the furrow between his brows. "What's that to you?" he asked, his voice soft as the crackle of a burning log. The stranger tucked the cloth back inside his cloak. "Nothing," he said, though the word tasted of a lie. "Nothing but trouble if the wrong ears hear of it. Thought you'd want to know. Folk here keep their heads low. Best they keep them that way." The tension snapped back like a drawn bowstring. The merchant shifted again, the box scraping faintly against the rushes beneath his boot. He lifted his mug to mask his unease, but his eyes darted to the door, measuring the shadows that pressed at the shutters. A gust of wind rattled the latch, and for a heartbeat all talk fell away. In that quiet, Leof's heart thudded so loud he wondered if they could hear it. The old hound's soft snore at his side, Maud's breath a thin whistle through her nose, the creak of Oswin's boots as he stepped back behind his counter. At last, the stranger drained his mug and set it down with a finality that spoke of roads yet to ride. He rose, the bench groaning as it slid over the floor. He met Oswin's eye, a silent exchange neither warm nor cold, only edged with the weary understanding of men who'd seen secrets stir beneath roof beams and knew better than to name them outright. "I'll sleep under the smith's lean-to tonight," the stranger said. "No coin for a bed, nor for prying eyes. Keep your door latched." Oswin only grunted again, wiping his hands on his apron. He did not offer another cup, nor did he ask for the truth behind the cloth. He simply watched as the man stepped to the door, lifting the latch with care, as if not to wake whatever waited in the darkness beyond. The door creaked wide, and the wind slipped in, brushing the gathered warmth with a sharp kiss of cold earth and wet bark. The stranger stepped out into it, his shape swallowed by night and the restless hiss of wind through the village lane. Inside, the hush remained, deeper now, thicker than before. The merchant sat rigid, his knuckles pale around his mug. Maud leaned closer to the hearth, her cane tapping once, twice, in slow warning. Leof reached into his tunic and touched the small wooden bird. Its wings felt steady in his palm, a weight that reminded him he was here, inside these stout walls that held secrets like barrels held ale, tight, dark, waiting to spill when the tap was struck just so. Oswin turned back to his counter, his hands moving to pour fresh ale for the charcoal burners, to nod at Maud when she asked for another sip of warm cider. His face gave nothing away, but in his mind, the echo of the stranger's rough voice lingered, like a cold draft beneath a locked door. Outside, the wind carried stories no tongue dared speak aloud. Stories that rattled shutters, slipped beneath thatch, and promised that this night was only the beginning of a long, uneasy season for the quiet tavern at the edge of a restless road. The sun had drifted low over the crooked rooftops of Dunwold by the time Alaric found himself standing once more at the threshold of the Thorned Boar. He lingered a moment in the dusky street, watching the lamplighter move down the lane, pole in hand, coaxing flickering flames into life one by one. Each lantern's glow seemed to mark a gentle promise of warmth against the encroaching dark. He breathed in the mingled scents of roasting meats and damp timber and allowed himself to imagine, just for a heartbeat, that the tavern might be a gateway to some secret world he had yet to uncover. Inside, the evening had gathered its usual congregation, a tangle of farmers, merchants, and wandering souls who all, in their own way, drifted toward the same hearth. The hearth itself crackled fiercely, logs spitting tiny embers that floated up the soot-dark chimney. A hush of conversation mixed with the occasional peal of laughter, and above it all, the soft, ceaseless creak of the signboard outside swaying in the wind. Alaric slipped through the doorway and found a narrow bench beside the old stonemason, Tovin, who raised his mug in a silent greeting before returning his attention to the dice he rattled against the scarred tabletop. Beyond Tovin, a pair of traveling players argued good-naturedly over a battered lute, its strings worn smooth by countless nights of ballads traded for warm bread and leftover ale. At the far end of the room, Dame Sarah's steady hands poured tankard after tankard, her face as calm as an abbess at prayer. She moved like someone who had long since accepted that secrets passed more freely over a wooden counter than in any whisper behind church walls. When Alaric caught her eye, she offered him that familiar, knowing smile, a thing that seemed to say, every story has a place to rest its weary bones. He leaned closer to Tovin, watching the stonemason roll the dice again. They clattered across the wood like tiny thunderclaps, coming to rest in a pattern only Tovin seemed to understand. With a grunt, the old man slid a copper piece across to his opponent, a boy no older than 16 with ink-stained fingers and a nervous glance that flicked to Alaric and back. "You've a look about you tonight," Tovin rasped without turning. "Like you've heard a ghost breathe your name." "Perhaps I have," Alaric said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He could feel the tavern's hum all around him, a pulse that had grown louder each evening, as if the walls themselves wished to speak. From the shadows near the hearth, a voice rose, a gentle lilting tone, threading through the tavern's hush. It was Etta, the seamstress's daughter, who had a way of turning a simple story into something that made grown men set aside their mugs to listen. Tonight, she spun a tale of a hidden tunnel beneath Dunwold's oldest tavern, a place long since burned down, they said, but whose secrets might yet be stitched into the very soil underfoot. "And some claim," Etta whispered, leaning forward so the flames danced in her eyes, "that the tunnel stretches from the ruins of the Silver Antler to the old chapel on the hill. Merchants once used it, they say, to hide their finest silks and spices from the king's men." A hush fell as her words faded into the crackle of the fire. For a moment, the room seemed to lean closer, every heart beating just a fraction slower in the candlelit gloom. Then a bark of laughter shattered the spell, old Bren the cooper wagging a finger at Etta. "Lass, you'd have us digging like moles if we listened to half your tales." But Etta only smiled, unbothered. "Perhaps you should, Bren. Perhaps you'd find more than you expect." Alaric felt the seed of an idea lodging itself deep within him. He had spent so long drifting from town to town, lingering in these ale-soaked corners, listening for something, he knew not what, that might give shape to his restless thoughts. And now here it was, a whisper of tunnels, hidden vaults, secrets so old they'd long since slipped from the lips of priests and thieves alike. He drained his mug and pushed it gently toward Dame Sarah, who replaced it with a fresh one without a word. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, perhaps, for some trace of what he sought. She said nothing, but when she turned to serve another patron, he could have sworn he heard her humming under her breath, An old lullaby his mother used to sing when he was small enough to believe that locked doors and monsters under beds could be banished by a simple tune. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the signboard so fiercely that it knocked against the wall in sharp, rhythmic taps. The boy with the ink-stained fingers leaned in, eyes wide. "Do you believe her?" he asked Alaric, voice low. "About the tunnels?" Alaric considered him, a boy with too many questions and nowhere safe to keep them. He remembered being that boy once. Perhaps he still was. "I believe there are always tunnels," he said softly. "Sometimes they're carved in stone, sometimes they're carved in men's hearts." The boy nodded, not understanding but willing to pretend. Tovin cackled at that, rolling his dice once more as if the future might tumble out alongside them. And so the night unspooled. Tankards drained and refilled, stories rising and falling like tides. In the corners, secrets passed hands as easily as coins, promises made, threats half-whispered, alliances forged in the hush of a shared drink. The thorned boar had become more than a refuge. It was a living thing, fed by rumor and hope, by despair and reckless laughter. As the hour crept toward midnight, Alaric rose from his bench and stepped into the courtyard behind the tavern. The air there was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth. He crouched low, brushing aside a pile of broken barrels, to see if any stonework below might reveal a hidden passage, a loose flagstone, a secret door. He found nothing, only the stubborn roots of an old oak pressing against the tavern's foundations like a promise that some secrets preferred to stay buried. Yet he felt it, the sense that the walls were listening, that beneath the flagstones, the old earth still remembered footsteps that had not seen daylight in centuries. He stood and turned back to the doorway, where Dame Sarah waited, her lantern casting a gentle circle of gold against the darkness. "Find what you were hoping for?" she asked. "Not tonight," he said, wiping his hands on his cloak, "but perhaps tomorrow." She gave him that same unhurried smile. "The boar will be here, lad. It always is." And so he stepped back inside, into the warmth, into the hum of half-spoken dreams and promises. The door swung shut behind him, and the night outside pressed its secrets ever deeper into the cold, waiting earth. When dawn peeled back the lingering fog that clung to Dunwold's crooked lanes, Alaric found himself awake before most of the town had even stirred. The thorned boar lay hushed in the soft blue gloom of early light. Tables abandoned, benches crooked, a single candle guttering on the bar, where Dame Sarah must have left it burning through the final hours of night. He moved quietly among the scattered tankards and half-empty jugs, mindful not to wake the two merchants snoring near the hearth, wrapped in their cloaks like children tucked against some remembered chill. Outside, the cobbled street gleamed with a thin sheen of dew, and the sky above threatened rain that had yet to break. Alaric stepped out, drawing his cloak tighter, and listened to the muted chorus of waking town life. The first iron strike of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant lowing of cattle driven toward market, the faint creak of a cart's axle somewhere beyond the square. Yet beneath these everyday murmurs lay something else, an echo of Etta's tale from the night before, winding like a thin ribbon of thought through Alaric's restless mind. A tunnel beneath a burned-down tavern, a passageway that might still link Dunwold's hidden heart to the chapel on the hill. He could not say why the idea gripped him so fiercely. Perhaps it was simply the promise that the world still held secrets, waiting to be coaxed from darkness into flickering lamplight. He turned away from the thorned boar, leaving its warmth behind him as he made for the lower edge of town, where the ruins of the Silver Antler slumped in a tangle of moss and half-buried stones. The path wound through the narrowest streets, past houses so close together their eaves nearly touched, past a crooked sign that read Hobbs Tack and Saddle, its letters faded by years of sun and rain. He found the ruins just as the sky broke open with a gentle drizzle, the stones darkening as they drank in the dawn's offering. What remained of the Silver Antler was little more than a low stack of scorched walls and a few charred beams, all half swallowed by ivy and nettles. Children sometimes dared each other to steal bits of blackened timber as charms against misfortune. Odd that they should think the bones of a ruin might guard them from ruin themselves. Alaric stepped carefully over a fallen lintel, his boots sinking into the soft earth that had once been the tavern's common floor. He imagined the place alive again. The smell of broth and beer, the chatter of travelers warming themselves by the same fire that had, in the end, consumed every beam and rafter. He pressed a palm to the damp stone and let the rain patter on his shoulders as if it might wash him clean of the ache that pulsed beneath his ribs. He knelt then, brushing aside layers of dead leaves and tangled weeds, searching for any sign that the ground might yield its secrets. A loose stone, a hollow beneath the flagging, some whisper that the stories were more than Etta's fancy. He found instead an old iron hinge, rusted through and half buried in mud. He turned it in his hand, feeling its weight, wondering what door it had once held fast. A cellar trap, perhaps? Or a hidden hatch behind the bar? His mind spun small possibilities into grand designs. The drizzle thickened into steady rain, drumming on his shoulders until he could feel the cold pressing through his cloak. He stood at last, glancing back toward the chapel that crowned the rise at the town's edge. From here, it looked impossibly distant, a smear of pale stone beneath the iron sky. If there was a tunnel, could it truly run so far beneath this sodden earth? How many feet of soil, how many walls and cellars would it pass under? He could not know, but he felt certain now that the tale was worth the telling, even if it ended in nothing more than stones and wishful thoughts. He returned to the thorned boar by mid-morning, rain dripping from his hood. Dame Sarah was awake now, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sweeping ash from the hearth into a neat pile. She looked up at him with a knowing tilt of her brow, but asked no questions as she set out a loaf of coarse, brown bread and a wedge of hard cheese on the bar. He ate without speaking, each bite grounding him in the here and now, while his mind tugged stubbornly at the thread of the tunnel's promise. It was Etta who found him there, staring into the ashes as if they might reveal a map burned into the coals. She slipped onto the bench beside him, her hair still damp from the rain, her eyes bright with mischief and the comfort of knowing things she ought not know. "You went to look, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft enough to slip between the murmurs of the waking tavern. "I did," Alaric confessed, "and I found nothing." Etta shrugged, unbothered. "Sometimes you find nothing at first. With sometimes you have to listen for the earth to speak." He almost laughed at that, at the earnestness of her faith in hidden things. But he did not, for he saw the spark in her gaze, the certainty that stories, once loosed upon the world, seldom chose to die quietly. "And if I wanted to listen better?" he asked. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspirator's hush. "There's an old man who comes through the market square every full moon, says he once poured ale at the Silver Antler before it burned. Some swear he's made, sees ghosts where there are none, hears songs in the wind, but he remembers things no one else bothers to remember." "When does he come again?" Etta glanced toward the small leaded window, where the rain streaked the glass in trembling rivulets. "Tomorrow's the full moon. He'll be there, same as always. Just look for the man with the crooked hat and the eyes like winter rain." Alaric nodded, feeling the gentle thrum of hope in his chest, a spark kindled by half a tale and the promise of an old man's memories. The thorned boar around him hummed back to life, the clatter of tankards, the soft murmur of footsteps overhead, the distant bark of a mongrel in the yard. He stayed there beside Etta as the morning wore on, the rain easing into a thin mist that wrapped Dunwold in a hush. And though his belly was full and the hearth warm behind him, his mind roamed the shadows beneath the town, tracing tunnels that might yet lead him to a secret buried deep in the bones of the earth, and deeper still in the hearts of those who dared to remember what the world would rather forget. By the time dusk once again draped its soft veil over Dunwold, the rain had settled into a lingering drizzle that painted the cobblestones slick and black beneath the lantern light. Alaric sat alone at a corner table in the Thorned Boar, his cloak drying by the hearth while the warmth seeped into his damp bones. Around him, the tavern hummed with the gentle din of evening custom. Voices low, laughter rising and falling like the flicker of candle flames, boots scuffing against the floorboards polished smooth by generations of restless feet. He watched Dame Sarah pour ale with her steady hands, watched Etta drift from bench to bench, trading scraps of gossip for scraps of bread. Yet for all the life that filled the taproom, Alaric's mind clung to the promise of the morrow, when the full moon would haul that old keeper of secrets from the shadows and into the lamplit square. Tonight, though, he needed rest. Or at least, he needed to sit still long enough to let his thoughts settle like silt in a riverbed. He found his gaze drifting to the ceiling beams overhead, tracing the dark knots in the wood, the scratches left by swords or boots or knives, marks of stories that no tongue would ever properly tell. A sudden hush fell over the room as the door swung open on a gust of rain-heavy wind. Heads turned, some with idle curiosity, others with suspicion as natural as breath. In stepped a stranger wrapped in a rough woolen cloak, hood pulled low. He paused in the doorway, as if weighing the warmth within against the chill he carried on his shoulders. Then he stepped inside, letting the door thud gently closed behind him. Alaric watched the stranger approach the bar, noting the heavy boots crusted with mud, the way his gloved hand lingered at his side, where a dagger might be hidden beneath the folds of his cloak. Dame Sarah raised an eyebrow at him, but asked no questions, only poured him a cup of mulled cider, which the man took without thanks. He moved to a bench near the hearth, where the fire's glow made his shadow dance along the wall behind him. Etta, curious as ever, drifted close to Alaric's table, lowering her voice to a whisper that only the two of them could share. "Never seen him before," she murmured. "Walks like he's got secrets too heavy for his pockets." Alaric only nodded, but inside, the small flame of curiosity flared. The thorn boar had always drawn the lost, the hunted, the weary, but tonight felt different. He watched the stranger sip his cider, his hood slipping back just enough to reveal a jaw bristled with 3 days' beard, eyes dark and restless beneath the flickering firelight. Moments passed in the hush between stories. A minstrel strummed a gentle tune on a battered lute, trying to coax coin from the pockets of those lulled by the melody. The notes mingled with the sigh of the wind outside, the hush of rain tapping the window panes. Then the stranger looked up, directly at Alaric. Their gazes locked, and for a heartbeat the tavern seemed to tilt, as though the weight of what was unsaid might break the floorboards beneath them. Without a word, the man rose and crossed the room, cider in hand, boots whispering over the rushes strewn on the floor. He stopped before Alaric's table, and though his eyes were shadowed, his voice when it came was soft. "Careful. You're the one asking about tunnels," he said. It was not a question, but a quiet certainty that slipped under Alaric's ribs like a cold blade. Alaric sat straighter, measuring the man before him. "And if I am?" The stranger glanced about, at Tovin snoring in the corner, at Dame Sarah watching with that calm that missed nothing, at Etta pretending not to listen, though she stood but a pace away. Then he pulled back the chair opposite Alaric and sat, leaning forward until the fire painted half his face in gold and left the other half to the shadows. "Names are nothing here," he said, voice low. "So don't ask mine. I'll not ask yours. But I heard your talk of passages, of cellars that breathe secrets when the moon is fat and the wind is right." Alaric said nothing, only waited. Sometimes silence was the best coin to buy trust. The stranger seemed to weigh him, then gave a slow nod. He drew from his cloak a scrap of old parchment, its edges ragged, the ink faded to the color of bruised plums. He laid it on the table between them, careful to shield it from any curious eyes. "I took this from the archives in Beresford before the magistrate's men burned half the ledgers," he murmured. "Old surveyor's mark, nothing but lines and scribbles to most. But look close." Alaric bent over the parchment, tracing the faint lines that crisscrossed a rough sketch of Dunwold's southern quarter. There, a faint dotted path, like the trail of an ant winding from a marked square, the silver antler, toward a circle labeled only with an indecipherable scrawl. "The chapel?" Alaric asked. The stranger's eyes glittered. "So they say. A priest's bolt hole, built when faith alone couldn't keep a man from the king's rope. It's old, older than the chapel itself, maybe. No one's found the mouth, not for 100 years. But the ground remembers. Stones remember." He folded the parchment again and tucked it back inside his cloak, as though to speak of it too long might tempt fate to snatch it from his hands. "What do you want in return?" Alaric asked at last. The man smiled, but it was not a pleasant thing, more a grim twist of lips that spoke of bargains made in darker places than this. "If you find it," he said, "I want passage. That's all. passage through the tunnels when the wrong men come knocking at my door." Alaric did not agree then, nor did he refuse. He only sat there as the fire burned low and the stranger's cider grew cold between his hands. In that small hush, with Edda's eyes wide and the storm still pressing at the walls, the promise of hidden ways beneath Dunwold settled like a breath in the bones of the thorned boar, another secret waiting to be coaxed from shadow into story. Morning came softly, as if it were reluctant to wake Dunwold from its slumber. A pale sun broke through the thinning clouds, casting a gentle light across the damp rooftops and slick cobblestones. The thorned boar stirred awake in its own quiet way, the hiss of water heating over the hearth, the muted clatter of tankards being set to dry, Dame Sarah's voice humming an old tune as she swept away the night's forgotten crumbs. Alaric sat by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the square below. Market stalls were already sprouting like mushrooms after rain, canvas awnings flapping in the chill breeze, merchants calling soft greetings to one another as they unpacked crates of onions, bolts of coarse linen, smoked fish strung in neat rows. And somewhere amid that slow unfurling of the day, the old man with the crooked hat was meant to appear, trailing stories no ledger would ever hold. Edda joined him at the window, balancing a bowl of steaming broth in her palms. She set it before him, nudging it closer when he failed to notice. "You'll want your wits warm," she said. "Stories are best caught when your belly isn't grumbling louder than your questions." He managed a faint smile for her, though his eyes never left the square. "Did he come last month?" She leaned against the post beside him, her reflection wavering in the glass. I stood by Hobbs' stall near the old well, talking to anyone who'd listen, and half who wouldn't. Some think he's lost half his mind to the years, but he remembers things like no one else does. They ate in silence then, spooning up the simple broth as the tavern settled into its morning rhythm. Boots crossing the threshold, warm mugs pressed into cold hands, voices weaving together in that gentle tapestry that made the thorned boar feel less a place and more a breathing thing. When he stepped out at last, the sun had climbed just high enough to chase the damp shadows back into the alleys. Edda trailed at his side, her cloak brushing the muddy street as they wove through the market's growing bustle. They passed the baker's stall, where rounds of dark rye steamed on splintered boards, past the tinker, setting out his rows of battered pans, past children darting like swallows between barrels stacked high with salted cod. Near the well, old stones ringed with moss and worn smooth by generations of calloused palms, they found him. The man could have been part of the well itself, so rooted did he seem to that spot. His hat was as crooked as Edda promised, its brim patched with scraps of wool in a dozen mismatched hues. His beard was long and thin, trailing down his chest like tangled twine, and his eyes, when he lifted them to Alaric's, were pale and sharp as a winter dawn. He was muttering to a peddler who stood half listening, half wishing himself elsewhere. The old man's voice was soft, but it carried an odd certainty, like the steady drip of water wearing away at stone. And the ale they poured at the Silver Antler could calm a man's grief, if only for a night. I saw old Jory pour it myself, I did. He'd tap the barrel twice, whisper a blessing so the king's men wouldn't smell the spice on the wind. Gone now, burned to soot and memory. The peddler caught sight of Alaric hovering behind the old man and seized his chance to slip away. The old man turned his watery gaze on Alaric and Edda, blinking as if to place them in some half-remembered ledger of faces. "You're not here for onions or salt cod, are you?" His voice cracked, but did not waver. "You've got the look of one who listens for things that ought to stay buried." Alaric inclined his head, respectful. "I heard you knew the Silver Antler before the fire. They say there were tunnels beneath it, passages the kings and priests forgot." The old man laughed then, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Forgot? Oh, lad, stone doesn't forget. Wood burns, men die, but stone remembers the weight of secrets better than any priest's tongue." He shuffled closer, and Alaric caught the sharp tang of ale and damp wool clinging to him like a second skin. The old man tugged at Alaric's sleeve with a trembling hand. "Once I saw the trapdoor. I did. Jory showed me when the storm flooded the cellar, said it was a smuggler's door long before the king's men ever cared for the taxes they'd lose to a secret cask or two. A narrow thing, covered by barrels and boards. It opened to steps that vanished under the street. Alaric felt his pulse quicken. Do you remember where it was? The old man's pale eyes darted about the market square, as if fearful the stones themselves might be listening. He leaned so close, Alaric felt the old man's breath, sour with age and secrets. Far corner of the taproom, he whispered, near the hearth where the floor dipped just so, like the builders meant the earth to swallow anything worth hiding. But mind you, what waits below ain't always keen to be found. Etta touched the old man's sleeve, her voice soft as a lullaby. And the tunnel? Where does it run? The man tilted his head back, as if seeing through the centuries layered in stone and dirt. Toward the chapel, so they claimed, or perhaps farther still. Some say it twists down to the riverbank, where boats could slip in and out beneath the moon's eye. But that's a story for fools and dreamers. Alaric slipped a few coins into the old man's palm, closing the curled fingers gently around them. The man stared at the silver as if it were a relic dredged up from the river mud. You've a kind face, he murmured, voice almost lost to the hum of the market. Don't let the tunnels steal it from you. Then he turned away, drifting through the crowd like a leaf borne by an unseen current, vanishing between bales of straw and barrels of saltfish until he was nothing more than another rumor carried on the wind. Alaric and Etta stood in the square, the well stones cool beneath their fingertips. Around them, Dunwold's market sang its ordinary song, coin against wood, laughter against rain. But beneath that simple chorus, a deeper note thrummed, the heartbeat of tunnels that waited in darkness, their secrets stitched tight into the earth, longing for voices to wake them once more. Long after the market's chatter faded into the hush of late afternoon, Alaric found himself once more standing among the broken stones of the Silver Antler's ruin. He had come alone this time, leaving Etta behind at the Thorned Boar with a promise that he would not be reckless. Though even as he spoke it, he knew there was a thin edge of untruth to that vow. Some secrets could not be coaxed to light without a measure of risk. The sky above was a dim stretch of bruised gray, the kind of dusk that pressed close to the earth, dampening sound and smell alike. Alaric picked his way across the sodden ground, boots sinking into the softened soil as he moved toward what had once been the far corner of the old taproom. He knelt there, brushing aside a carpet of damp leaves and brittle twigs. Beneath the debris lay the same scorched flagstones he had touched days before, cold under his palms, stubbornly silent. He leaned closer, squinting at the cracks where stone met stone. The old man's words echoed in his mind. Near the hearth, where the floor dipped just so. He pressed his fingers into the grooves, seeking the subtle hollow that might betray the mouth of a long-forgotten tunnel. For a while there was nothing, only the hush of dusk, the whisper of the wind threading through blackened beams. Then, beneath his touch, he felt it. The faintest seam, a place where the stones did not quite meet, where the soil had sunk just slightly more than its neighbors. Heart beating faster, Alaric pulled his dagger from his belt and wedged the point into the seam. He worked it gently, testing for movement. At first, the stone resisted him stubbornly, clinging to its centuries of sleep. But then, slowly, with a soft sigh of loosened earth, it shifted, tilting upward just enough for him to catch the edge with his fingertips. He paused, drawing in a steadying breath, as though the very air might press a blessing on what he was about to disturb. Then he lifted the stone free, revealing a dark mouth beneath. A hole no wider than his shoulders, lined with rough-cut steps descending into the unseen belly of the ground. A musty draft breathed out at him, cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp soil and the faintest trace of old ash. He crouched there for a long moment, peering into the black. The passage yawned downward at a gentle slope, its walls hemmed close by ancient stonework, braced with beams that looked more bone than timber after so many hidden years. He struck a flint against the rim of his dagger, coaxing a small flame to life at the end of a pitch-soaked torch. The light flared, flickering shadows against the ruin's remains, pushing the darkness back only a few feet into the narrow stair. With a final glance at the soft gray sky above, his last promise of the world he knew, Alaric stepped down into the passage. The first footfall echoed oddly, the stone beneath cold and slick with trickling moisture. He moved carefully, ducking his head where the low ceiling forced him to bow. Behind him, the ruin's broken mouth seemed to tighten, shrinking into a pinprick of pale dusk as he descended further from the world's reach. Each step carried him deeper into the hush. The tunnel was older than he'd guessed. Its stones bore marks of tools long rusted away, runnels where water had carved its patient path for decades, perhaps centuries. Now and then he paused, pressing a hand to the wall to feel the pulse of the earth beyond. Somewhere far above, Dunwold's lanes bustled with ordinary life. Merchants haggling over grain, mothers calling children in for supper, Dame Sarah lighting the hearth at the Thorned Boar. Down here, time seemed to coil in on itself, thick and slow. He passed an old beam braced across the ceiling, half rotted through, but still holding the stones above in a trembling truce. Beneath his feet, the steps gave way to packed earth and loose gravel. He knelt once more, torch held low, to study the marks at the tunnel's edge, scratches in the soil, as though someone had dragged crates or barrels through this hidden throat long ago. Smugglers, perhaps, ferrying forbidden spice or fine cloth beneath the noses of the king's tacksmen. Or priests, carrying relics away from grasping hands when the winds of power turned sharp. A little farther on, the tunnel split. One branch curved, gently left, deeper into shadow. The other sloped more steeply down, its mouth swallowed by darkness, so complete it seemed to drink the torchlight. Alaric held the flame between the two, listening for any whisper of draft or hidden passage of air. The left passage carried a faint sigh, damp and chill, like river fog slipping through a crack. He chose it, trusting the breath of earth more than the black maw that waited to swallow him whole. As he walked, the passage widened by degrees until he could stand tall once more. His footsteps sounded strange now, softened by patches of moss clinging to the damp stone. The walls bore faint marks here, symbols he did not know, lines and circles etched by a careful hand. He traced them with his fingertips, feeling the slight bite of the carving beneath the grime. Some old faith, perhaps, scratched into the secret dark to keep watch when the world above turned cruel. After what felt like an age, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, a pocket of stone carved by patient hands and flickering dreams. The air here was warmer, touched by some hidden current that whispered through cracks unseen. At the far wall stood an old wooden door, so warped and swollen by damp that it seemed more part of the wall than passage to anywhere else. Iron bands still clung to its surface, rusted but stubborn. A latch, simple and crude, waited beneath his hand. Alaric lifted the torch, letting the flame cast its flicker across the door's rough grain. He pressed his palm to the latch, feeling the cold bite of iron, the softness of rot beneath his fingertips. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he should turn back, if perhaps some secrets deserved to remain buried in the hush of old stone and dark earth. But then he thought of the stranger's parchment, the old man's whisper by the well, the map half-etched in the hush between tankards at the Thorned Boar. He thought of the tunnels that had waited so patiently for feet to find them again. He pushed the latch. The door shuddered under his hand, then gave way with a low groan, swinging inward to reveal another passage, wider than before, lined with brick that glowed red in the torchlight. Alaric stepped through, the hush of the tunnel pressing close around him once more, carrying him deeper still into the hidden veins that wound beneath Dunwold's ancient heart. The door's echo faded into the hush behind him as Alaric stepped forward, his torch casting long, restless shadows along the brick-lined walls. Here, the air was different. Warmer, yes, but tinged with something more. The faint, stale scent of long-dead smoke, and the earthy tang of places left to the patience of spiders and time. The floor beneath his boots was surprisingly even, laid with old stone slabs that had settled into the soil, but still bore the mark of careful hands. He moved slowly, mindful of each step, the hiss of the torch his only companion in this hollow vein beneath Dunwold. The bricks here were not like the rough-cut stones of the first tunnel. They were shaped and set with deliberate care, their joints neat, their faces scored with the passage of many hands. Marks of a people who'd built not just to hide, but to endure. As he walked, the tunnel widened once more until it became a corridor, high enough that the shadows stretched away into a barrel vault above. Now and then he passed niches carved into the walls, some empty, but for drifts of fallen dust and the brittle bones of small creatures, others holding the husks of old clay jars sealed tight with ancient wax. He paused at one, brushing his thumb over the cracked rim, wondering what secrets lay within. Spice? Oil? Perhaps a relic hidden when the world above grew too dangerous to trust. Farther on, the passage bent gently to the right, the bricks slick with a sheen of moisture that gleamed like oil under the torchlight. Here, his breath sounded loud, and each heartbeat drummed like a distant footfall against the walls. He found himself listening for other sounds, voices, the scrape of movement, anything to betray that he was not alone in this place that felt so keenly alive with memory. At the bend, the corridor opened into a chamber, round as a coin and capped with a low, domed ceiling. The walls were ringed with alcoves, most empty, but for rotting shelves and crumbled stone benches. In the center of the chamber stood a single pillar of carved granite, its surface etched with more of those looping symbols he had seen before. He held the torch close, studying the careful lines that spiraled around the pillar like a vine. The markings made no sense to him. An old tongue, perhaps, or a cipher left by hands that trusted only the stone to remember. He traced a curve with his fingertip, feeling the cold bite of the carved groove. Beneath his touch, the pillar seemed almost to hum with the echo of voices too old to name. He let the torch drift lower, and at the base of the pillar he saw what might have once been a small altar, a shallow bowl carved from the same granite, stained dark by centuries of offerings. Bits of wax clung to the edges, as long since hardened into brittle curls. He imagined flickering candles once set here, each flame a vow to keep secrets safe in the earth's embrace. Alaric's gaze drifted from the pillar to the alcoves. Something caught his eye in the nearest niche, a glint, faint but sharp against the gloom. He stepped closer, brushing away a drift of damp debris, to find a small iron box no bigger than his hand, half sunk into the stone shelf. Its hinges were green with age, but when he lifted it, the lid gave with a soft creak, as if even the rust had decided its time as guardian was done. Inside lay scraps of parchment, so brittle he feared they might dissolve at his breath. He lifted one carefully, holding it near the torch. The ink had faded to ghostly strokes, but he could make out a few looping letters. Nothing he could read, but the shape of them was enough to stir his thoughts. A ledger, perhaps, or a confession sealed away when the world above threatened to pry too deeply. He replaced the scrap and set the box gently back in its alcove, a small part of him glad that some secrets remained just out of reach. Then he turned back to the passage that led away from the chamber, its mouth framed by a low arch of brick where soot had blackened the mortar. He held the torch aloft, peering into the dark. There, farther on, he thought he saw the faint glimmer of water, a sheen that caught the flickering flame and fractured it into tiny stars. He stepped forward, boots crunching over old grit, the hush closing around him once more. The tunnel sloped down, the walls damp with weeping rivulets that trickled into a narrow channel at the passage's edge. The sound of it soothed him, a steady trickle that reminded him of rain tapping the tavern's eaves, so different, yet so strangely the same. As he walked, he felt the weight of the ground above. He imagined Dunwold's streets, the market square, the thorned boar with its low hum of laughter and secrets traded over tankards of spiced ale. All of it pressed down through layers of earth and time to this place where no one but stones and hidden dreams kept watch. At last, the passage widened once more, opening into a vaulted space so large the edges vanished into shadow beyond the torch's reach. Here, the ceiling dripped with thin roots that hung like pale threads, swaying in the draft of his approach. The air tasted of earth and old water, tinged with something metallic, iron perhaps, or the memory of coins once hidden here in trust or treachery. Against the far wall he saw it, a low archway of carved stone, half collapsed but passable, leading onward still. Beside it lay a pile of rotting barrels, their iron bands rusted to powder, the wood so soft it flaked at his touch. He imagined them once brimming with wine, spice, or salt, wealth enough to make a man vanish from the king's ledgers forever. Alaric knelt beside one barrel, pressing his palm to its crumbling rim. He thought of the stranger with his parchment map, the old man with winter's eyes by the well, Edda's story spun like golden thread by the hearth. All those whispers had led him here, to this hush beneath the hush, where every heartbeat sounded like a promise between the stones. He rose, lifted his torch high, and stepped through the archway. The tunnel beyond breathed cold against his face, a sigh from the depths that seemed almost to speak. There is more. There is always more. So he pressed on, deeper still, his footsteps swallowed by the dark, the torchlight flickering like a lone star in a sky of endless earth. The air in the next passage was cooler still, tasting faintly of stone and the distant ghost of river water. Alaric moved with care, the torch trembling in his grip each time his boot scraped over loose gravel. Behind him, the hush of the tunnel gathered like a slow-breathing thing, alive yet silent, watching yet unseen. This stretch of the passageway felt older than all the rest, older, perhaps, than even the ruin above. The walls were no longer the neat brickwork of hidden cellars and smugglers' halls, but rough-hewn bedrock, scored here and there with marks that might have been chisels or claws, or simply the patient touch of water over centuries. He paused to press his palm against the stone. It was cold and damp, humming faintly with the life that runs through all deep places. He wondered who had first pressed tools into this earth. Monks with secrets to hide? Outlaws desperate for a path unseen? Or some older hand, carving out a refuge when Dunwold itself was nothing more than a scatter of huts by the river's bend? The torch cast wild shapes along the jagged walls, catching on veins of mineral that glittered like dull gold before winking back into shadow. Here and there, he found the remnants of old supports, planks half rotted through, iron nails black with rust. One had given way entirely, leaving a low mound of fallen rock that forced him to stoop, the flame licking dangerously close to the ceiling as he crawled through on his hands and knees. On the far side, the passage widened once more into a narrow chamber where the walls seemed to breathe with damp. In the center lay a shallow pool of water, perfectly still, reflecting his torchlight in trembling ripples. Alaric crouched at its edge, peering into its mirror-smooth surface. Beneath the water, the stones gleamed pale and slick, veined with veins of some darker ore that seemed to pulse under the flicker of firelight. He dipped his fingers in, and the cold bit through skin to bone. The pool shivered, sending soft rings outward, and in that moment, the silence pressed so close, he half expected a voice to rise from its depths. But nothing stirred, except the gentle echo of droplets falling from the roots above. Tapping the pool like an old clock measuring time that no longer mattered. Rising again, he traced the chamber's edge until he found, half hidden behind a curtain of hanging roots, another narrow passage. This one was so low he had to duck, brushing aside the pale threads that clung to his shoulders like the touch of forgotten hands. The walls here were close, so close that his torch guttered once against the damp. For a terrible heartbeat, he thought the flame would vanish, plunging him into a darkness that no promise of daylight could lift. But it caught again, the ember biting back to life, licking the pitch rag into new glow. He exhaled, shoulders pressed tight to the rough stone as he inched forward. Then, quite suddenly, the passage fell away beneath his boots. He stumbled, nearly dropping the torch as he slid down a short incline of loose gravel, landing hard on his side in a small hollow chamber. He lay there a moment, breath caught in his chest, listening for the whisper of collapse that never came. Only the steady trickle of water from somewhere deeper in the dark answered him, an underground stream winding its hidden way through the bones of Dunwold. He pushed himself upright and lifted the torch. Before him stretched a rough vault, not carved but shaped by water and time, a natural hollow that the older tunnels must have stumbled into by accident or design. Along the walls, faint marks showed where someone, long ago, had hammered iron spikes to anchor ropes or lantern hooks. Here, the air was thick with the smell of wet stone and the faint, sharp tang of old iron. At the far end of this vault, a low stone ledge rose from the earth, and upon it sat the remnants of what might once have been crates, now nothing more than collapsed frames and rusted nails. He stepped closer, careful not to let his torch brush the ledge's brittle edges. Beneath the ruin of wood lay a scattering of old sacks, rotted through so thoroughly that they fell apart under the gentlest touch. Inside the split burlap, he glimpsed dull black lumps, coal perhaps, or ore, or something more valuable once spirited out beneath the king's watchful men. A soft scurry in the darkness drew his eyes upward. Near the ledge's base, a thin seam of stone gave way to yet another opening, a crawl space barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through. He crouched to peer inside. It sloped gently upward, the scent of fresh, cold air threading faintly through the damp, an exhale of the world beyond the tunnels, carrying the ghost of wind and leaf mold from above. He thought then of the chapel on the hill, its stones catching moonlight that drifted down to this hidden underworld. Could this passage truly reach so far? Or would it twist and turn until it spat him out in some forgotten cellar, some bramble-choked hollow beneath Dunwold's crumbling walls? He lowered his head, testing the squeeze with his shoulders. The stone was cold and close, pressing in on all sides like the tight embrace of the earth itself. But the promise of open air tugged at him, stronger than fear, stronger than the hush that whispered of secrets meant to stay folded in the dark. With a steady breath, Alaric pushed the torch ahead of him and slipped into the narrow vein of stone, the hush of the vault left behind as he crawled upward, the taste of fresh wind a promise that somewhere beyond this winding throat of earth, the world waited, full of stories yet to be told. The stone pressed close as Alaric crawled, shoulders brushing rough walls that seemed to pulse with the hush of centuries. Each pull forward scraped his elbows raw. Each push of his boots sent small showers of grit trickling back down the narrow passage. Ahead, the torch guttered and flickered, its flame fighting for air in the cramped dark. Yet even as sweat chilled on his back and the closeness of the stone squeezed at his lungs, the faint thread of fresh wind kept him moving, an invisible hand, gentle but insistent, drawing him on. Time lost its shape in that crawl space. It might have been moments or an hour when the stone finally widened enough for him to lift his head and stretch his back. He paused there, crouched in a small hollow where the ceiling rose just high enough for him to kneel upright. He held the torch high, its glow licking at walls streaked with pale minerals that gleamed like veins of frozen moonlight. Droplets of water clung to the ceiling, trembling at the faint tremor of his breath. He touched the wall, palm flat to the cold stone, listening. Beyond the hush of his own heartbeat, he thought he heard something more. A soft murmur, like the sigh of wind through old branches. It seemed impossible, so deep below ground, yet it curled through the stone with the promise of the world above. He moved on, drawn by that whisper. The crawlspace dipped once more, then climbed, the stone smoothing under his palms as though shaped not by chisel, but by the patient hand of water alone. His torch sputtered at the incline, smoke curling back to sting his eyes. He pressed on anyway, blinking through tears until the slope leveled and the stone gave way to timber, a rough frame bracing the narrow passage where ancient beams strained beneath the weight of earth. Here he paused, for the timbers bore marks, deep gouges like teeth or blades had worried at them long ago. Some were splintered through entirely, replaced by crude props of iron and stone. He tested one beam with his shoulder. It held, groaning softly, but beyond it the tunnel's hush changed. The air felt different, less stale, tinged with something sweet and cold. The draft had grown stronger too, teasing the edge of the torch's flame until it danced and hissed with every breath of the hidden breeze. Beyond the timbers, the passage widened again, stone giving way to brick once more. Red and crumbling, threaded with roots that pushed between the mortar like veins through flesh. He stepped carefully now, mindful that every wall and ceiling here held the weight of the world above. One careless footfall, one stray ember, and this hidden throat could close forever, burying its stories in a silence too deep for memory. At last he came upon another door, this one arched and banded with iron so eaten by rust it seemed more part of the stone than a barrier within it. A crude latch clung to the frame, its bolt locked in place, with a nail driven through the hole where a proper lock might once have been. Alaric leaned close, pressing an ear to the damp wood. On the other side, silence, deep and whole, but for that same soft sigh of wind. He pried the nail loose with his dagger, the metal shrieking softly as it yielded. The bolt slid free with a dull scrape. He pressed his shoulder to the door, and it swung inward on complaining hinges, the sound too loud in the hush. Beyond lay a stair, old stone, worn smooth at the center where countless feet had pressed it down. It rose in a gentle spiral, the walls tight and close, the air tasting unmistakably of the world above, wet leaves, moss, the faint tang of open sky. Alaric felt his chest tighten, a strange relief blooming behind his ribs at the scent of air unbound by stone. Step by careful step, he climbed, the torchlight painting wild shadows that curled like living things along the curve of the stairwell. He counted each step as he rose, 20, 30, 40, until the stair ended at a heavy trapdoor of thick oak braced with iron bands. The grain was dark with age, the iron cold under his fingertips. He listened again, but there was only the hush, no footsteps, no voices, only the promise that beyond this door, the secret path might meet the moonlight at last. He braced the torch on a step, worked the old latch with careful hands, and pressed upward. The trapdoor resisted at first, swollen by damp and age. He pushed harder, muscles straining, until it shifted with a low, wooden groan. A crack of moonlight split the dark, silver and thin. Alaric sucked in a breath of cold night air, his lungs drinking deeply as if to banish the damp hush of the tunnels from his bones. He lifted the trapdoor fully, bracing it open with his shoulder, and peered into the space beyond. He found himself in a crypt, stone walls close and chill, the air filled with the faint scent of old incense and moss. Above him, narrow windows cut into the walls framed slivers of night sky where the moon hung heavy and full, just as Etta had said it would. Rough-hewn coffers lined the walls, some sealed tight, others open and empty save for scraps of cloth and brittle bones. A single stone stair climbed from the crypt's edge to a low archway that led, he knew, to the chapel above. He hauled himself up and out, leaving the torch guttering on the stair below. The hush of the tunnels faded behind him, replaced by the solemn stillness of the chapel's oldest bones. He rested a hand on the nearest stone coffin, tracing its cold edge, feeling the hush here too, but different. Not the clutching dark of secrets buried deep, but the soft quiet of prayers whispered into ancient stone. Somewhere above, the wind caught in the chapel's eaves, sighing through cracks in the slate roof. Alaric stood very still, his breath misting in the moonlight spilling through the crypt's narrow slits. In that moment, he felt the weight of the earth beneath him, the hush of tunnels twisting far below, and the world above, vast and restless, waiting for footsteps that dared trace its hidden veins. With a final glance down the stair, he stepped toward the archway, the hush of the tunnels at his back, and the whisper of moonlit secrets drawing him forward into the waiting dark of the chapel nave. The air within the old chapel felt centuries thick, each breath laced with the memory of candle smoke and forgotten prayers. Alaric stood in the shadowed nave, his boots silent on the flagstone floor, worn smooth by generations of quiet footsteps. Overhead, the ribs of the vaulted ceiling cradled the night sky through small, cracked panes of colored glass, the moon's silver touch slipping in to cast soft pools of shifting color across the stone. He moved slowly down the aisle, every sense tuned to the hush that clung to these walls. Where the tavern buzzed and hummed with laughter and secrets shared over tankards, this place held its whispers closer, tucked in the cold corners, woven into the cobwebs that fluttered like tattered banners from old beams. On either side, wooden pews leaned at odd angles, their edges gnawed by damp and time. Some still bore the faint carvings of names or prayers, initials lost to any living tongue, but echoing still in the hush that wrapped the chapel like a shroud. Alaric paused to run his fingers over one such mark, a crude cross flanked by a pair of interlocked circles, a symbol of unity or a sign to those who knew how to read the hidden tongue of old oaths. At the far end of the nave rose the altar, simple stone draped now in dust and shadows. A single candlestick, long since emptied of any living flame, stood sentinel atop it. Behind, the wall bore a faded fresco of saints whose eyes seemed to watch him, half blind yet knowing. One figure, robed in deep blue, held a key pressed to her chest, a key painted in gold so thin that it caught the moonlight even now, centuries since the brush last touched the plaster. Alaric stepped closer, drawn by that sliver of gold. The key, no bigger than his hand, was rendered with surprising care, each tooth distinct, its bow shaped like an open eye. Beneath it, a line of ancient script curled along the hem of the saint's robe. He could not read it, but the shape of the letters stirred something at the edge of memory, like the symbols he had traced on the stone pillar deep below. He wondered then if the chapel and the tunnels had always been bound by more than stone and secrecy. Perhaps the builders had known that faith and concealment were twin branches of the same old tree, roots sunk deep, branches reaching for the same hidden light. He turned from the fresco and circled the altar, eyes searching the flagstones beneath. There, just behind it, half concealed by the stone shadow, lay a small iron ring set into the floor. He crouched, brushing away dust and bits of fallen mortar until the outline of a narrow trapdoor took shape around it. Its wood was darker than the surrounding stone, edges rimmed with iron banding like the door deep below. Alaric curled his fingers around the cold ring and gave a gentle tug. The wood shifted with a faint, reluctant creak, but held fast. Swollen, perhaps, or wedged by centuries of silence. He wedged his shoulder against it, braced his boots against the altar's base, and heaved once more. The trapdoor gave with a groan that rolled through the nave like a whispered confession, revealing a shallow cavity lined with old bricks. Inside, a set of narrow steps dropped away into blackness. They were dry enough that dust rose in faint ghosts when he brushed his fingers along them. It struck him then. Another passage, another hidden vein stitched through the earth beneath the chapel. Not as deep or long as the tunnel from the Silver Antler, perhaps, but a hiding place all the same. He lowered himself onto the first step, the hush of the nave pressing close behind him. The chill that rose from the cavity felt different than the damp earth taste of the tunnels. This air was still, as if it had waited for centuries for a breath to disturb it. At the bottom of the steps, he found himself in a small chamber no larger than a cellar room. Old shelves lined the walls, many collapsed under the weight of damp and rot. Amid the debris, he glimpsed the glint of glass, bottles, flasks, a cracked decanter whose stopper lay like a dead insect beside it. He lifted one carefully. Inside, a swirl of black sediment clung to the glass walls, ink perhaps, or some tincture long dried to dust. Against the far wall stood a chest, iron-banded, its surface marked with deep scratches where someone, once desperate or cautious, had tried to pry it open. The lock was long gone, the hasp cracked clean through. Alaric knelt and lifted the heavy lid, its hinges squealing in protest. Inside, a scatter of scraps, bits of parchment gone soft with age, the edge of a leather-bound book chewed by mold, a small linen sack tied tight with cord that crumbled at his touch. He untied the sack. Inside, coins spilled into his palm, dull and tarnished, stamped with faces he did not know, kings long buried under the same hush that now curled around his boots. Not wealth enough to matter anymore, yet their weight was oddly comforting, proof that someone had trusted this hidden hollow with something they could not risk above. He sat back on his heels, the hush of the secret room pressing close, the world above feeling impossibly far. He pictured the Thornbore's hearth, Etta leaning close to whisper her next story, Dame Sarah humming softly while the wind rattled the signboard outside. All of it seemed woven to this place, each secret traded for warmth and drink, echoing the deeper trades made here. Faith for safety, gold for silence, stories for shadows. Alaric rose at last, coins clinking faintly in the sack he tucked into his cloak. He cast one last look around the hidden room, then climbed the steps back into the chapel, drawing the trapdoor shut behind him. The hush folded over it like a blanket, secrets stitched back into stone. He stepped into the moonlight that spilled through the broken glass, its glow pooling around him in soft silver. Somewhere beyond these walls, Dunwold slept, oblivious to the restless hush that wound through its roots. Alaric moved through the nave's length once more, boots whispering over stone, a small weight of forgotten coin warming his side, and in the hush, he heard the soft promise of more yet to be uncovered, more stories half buried in the earth, waiting for footsteps brave enough to wake them. The days that drifted over the Green Hart Tavern had begun to grow longer, yet the air inside seemed to gather shadows as if the walls themselves wished to hush the sun. Within, the hearth still flickered, though the fire was now but a sleepy creature, half curled in the grate, glowing with more memory than heat. Above it, a soot-darkened beam bore the marks of decades, perhaps centuries, of tankards raised in laughter and in sorrow alike. In this hush, a new hush that was neither day nor night, Oswin found himself drawn to the far corner of the taproom, where an old stone floor dipped slightly, forming a shallow hollow no larger than a cartwheel. No one knew who had made it or why it had settled so. Some said it was where an ancient brewing cask once leaked ale so steadily that the stone gave way in surrender. Others whispered of a hidden cistern beneath, or a secret well that once fed the tavern when drought gripped the village. Whatever its origin, the hollow had become a place of quiet conversation, a conspirator's nook, a lover's alcove, or a refuge for the weary who wished not to be seen. It was here that tonight Oswin found the brewer's boy, a thin-limbed youth named Elric, half hidden behind the bulge of an old barrel. Elric's eyes were the color of raw honey under candlelight, wide and brimming with a restless curiosity. He had been in the tavern since boyhood, learning the craft from his father, who in turn had learned it from his mother, a line of ale brewers unbroken since the reign of the old king, whose portrait still hung crookedly above the hearth. Oswin lowered himself onto the stone beside Elric, careful to let his weight settle slowly so the old joints in his knees did not crack too loudly. Elric looked up at him, his freckled face dappled by the shifting flame. There was a question there, waiting to be asked. "What brings you here tonight?" Oswin asked, his voice soft, as if trying not to wake the ghosts that surely dozed in the beams overhead. Elric hesitated. "I was thinking about the barrels," he said at last. "About how they travel, how they come and go." Oswin followed his gaze to where rows of stout oak barrels sat lined against the far wall, their round bellies stamped with marks from brewers far and near, some from the next village, some from across the sea. Each barrel carried a name, a mark of pride, or a promise that what lay inside was worth a man's coin and a woman's smile. "They see more of the world than most folk ever will," Oswin murmured. "They cross rivers and roads, and when they return, they bring back more than ale. They bring tales." Elric's lips twitched into a ghost of a smile. "Sometimes I think I'd like to be a barrel." "A barrel?" Oswin chuckled, though softly. "Why so?" "They're sturdy," Elric said. "They float if they must. They roll wherever they're needed. And when they're empty, there's always the promise they'll be filled again. They're never truly done." Oswin sat with that thought for a while, listening to the faint crackle of the hearth and the quiet clink of tankards being stacked behind the bar. He thought of all the barrels he had helped hoist and tap in his youth, how each one had carried not just ale, but the laughter and quarrels of those who gathered around them. Each one was like a vessel for the lives poured into the tavern, absorbing secrets, witnessing toasts, lending comfort when words failed. He turned to Elric, his eyes searching the boy's bright face. "Did you know," he began, "that in some places they say a good barrel must be blessed before it holds its first brew? A cooper might lay his tools aside, whisper a prayer, sprinkle a drop of strong spirits upon the staves. So the wood remembers, they say. So it keeps the ale honest." Elric's eyes widened. "And does it?" Oswin smiled faintly. "I like to think so. A barrel that holds honest ale holds honest hearts, too. Or perhaps it's the other way round." They fell quiet again, and in that silence, Oswin's mind drifted back through the decades to a night when he himself was not much older than Elric, new to the tavern's rhythms, eager to please, terrified of spilling more than he served. He remembered how he, too, would slip into corners like this, half listening to the older men's tales of barrel-laden ships that never returned, of smugglers who hid coins beneath the hoops, of desperate villagers who cracked open the cooper's casks in lean winters when bread was gone, but drink might soften hunger's bite. He wondered then what Elric might become, if he would remain forever a brewer's boy, or if someday he would step through the Green Heart's stout wooden door and not return for years, bringing back a barrel stamped with his own mark, stories brimming as bright as new ale. Oswin shifted, feeling the stone cold beneath him. He looked once more at Elric, who now leaned back against the barrel as if it were a throne. "Tell me," Oswin said, "if you were a barrel, where would you wish to go?" Elric tilted his head, eyes darting toward the smoke-darkened rafters, as if the answer might be carved there. "Somewhere the sea can touch," he said finally. "I'd like to see the docks, ships coming in heavy with spices and silks, fishermen mending nets, sailors singing songs in tongues I don't know." Oswin laughed gently. "Then you'll need a stout stave and a tight hoop to weather the salt." They both grinned at this, the thought as warming as any ale. Beyond them, the tavern hummed on. A small knot of farmers swapping gossip, an old woman nodding off in her chair, the barmaid wiping down tables and humming tunelessly. The Green Heart was alive, but in that hollow corner, it felt like a world apart. As they sat together, a breeze slipped through the cracked shutters, carrying with it a distant scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a reminder that outside the tavern's sturdy walls, the world kept its secrets close. Yet here, within this hollow, two souls shared a secret of their own, a dream of barrels that sailed the seas and returned, always returned, full of promise. Oswin rose at last, his knees creaking like old floorboards. He placed a hand on Elric's shoulder, a weight both gentle and steady. "Come, lad," he said. "Help me see to the barrels. There's talk that one from the coast is due tonight, if the roads are kind. Let's make sure there's room for its tales." Elric scrambled to his feet, his weariness forgotten for a moment, replaced by that boundless curiosity that made even the oldest ale taste new. Together they crossed the dim taproom, leaving the hollow behind to dream its own quiet dreams, while the tavern walls listened, patient as ever, to the secrets that drifted in like the sea's own whisper. The hour grew late, and the Greenheart Tavern seemed to settle deeper into its ancient bones. Outside, the night pressed its cool hands against the leaded windows, whispering through the thatch and tugging gently at the old oak door. Within, the taproom hummed with a softer energy, less the raucous clatter of early evening and more the low, murmuring warmth of folk reluctant to abandon the hearth. Behind the bar, Maud the keeper wiped her hands on her linen apron, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, the faint flush of exertion on her cheeks. She had overseen this tavern's rhythms for 2 decades and more, and though her hair had grown silver at the temples, her eyes held the same sharp gleam they did when she first stood behind the polished counter. Tonight, she watched Oswin and young Elric haul the new barrel in through the back door, a broad-bellied cask bound with iron hoops, its wood damp from the night's mist. They rolled it carefully across the flagstone floor, their boots thudding softly as they settled it near the hearth where the warmth would ease the chill from its staves. Maud said nothing at first. She merely tilted her head, listening to the hollow slosh within. She could judge a barrel's worth by ear alone, a trick her mother had taught her when Maud was barely tall enough to see over the bar. "A good weight," she said at last, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade through fleece. "Was the road rough?" Oswin straightened, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Muddy, but passable. The carter says more are coming before week's end, if the river doesn't swell too high." Maud nodded, already calculating in her mind how much ale would flow, how many coins might change hands, how many stories would unfurl beneath her roof. She tapped the barrel with her knuckles, 3 quick raps that echoed just enough to satisfy her. "Set it to breathe, then tap it come sunrise," she instructed. "No sense hurrying good brew." Elric crouched beside the barrel, tracing his fingers along the cooper's mark burned into its head, a curling wave and a pair of crossed oars. This was no local make. It had come upriver from the coast, as he had dreamed in the hollow not an hour before. "What's this mark?" he asked, not looking up. Maud stepped closer, her shadow folding over him. "That," she said, "is a sign of the White Gull Brewers of Dunmere, salt air folk. They say their barrels carry a taste of the sea in every sip, fisherman's ale, strong enough to warm a man soaked to the bone," Oswin chuckled, "and strong enough to empty his purse twice as quick." Maud shot him a look, but did not disagree. She placed a hand on the barrel, palm flat, as though feeling for a heartbeat. In her mind, she could almost see the journey this cask had made, loaded onto a creaking cart at the quay, ferried past muddy estuaries, rattled over rutted lanes, pausing at crossroads inns to rest alongside other barrels, other stories. "Make sure the tap's clean," she told Elric, "and mind the spile when you drive it in. White Gull ale'll foam fierce if you're clumsy." Elric nodded, absorbing each word like a dry cloth soaks spilled cider. He liked that Maud trusted him with such tasks now, trusted his hands with work that mattered. It made him feel older than his years, which some nights was comfort enough. As Oswin and Elric busied themselves near the hearth, Maud turned her gaze to the tables scattered through the taproom. At one, a pair of farmhands slouched shoulder to shoulder, their heads bent in whispered complaint about the rising cost of grain. At another, a peddler sat alone, his pack at his feet, and a small carved whistle rolling between his fingers. Every so often he lifted the whistle as if to play, then seemed to think better of it, slipping it back into his pocket as though the night was not yet ready for music. Near the window, a man in a hooded cloak sat with his back to the wall. He nursed his tankard in slow sips, eyes flicking from shadow to flickering candle, as though waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. Maud watched him a moment longer than the rest, long enough to tuck his face away in her memory, one more stranger to weigh when the hour grew quieter still. When at last she was satisfied all was in its place, Maud ducked behind the bar and retrieved a small tin box from a shelf below the counter. She opened it carefully, revealing a cluster of beeswax stoppers, a folded scrap of parchment, and a single brass key worn smooth by years of turning. She set the key aside, running her thumb over the stoppers instead. Each one was hand-rolled by her own mother, back when she was alive, back when the tavern seemed impossibly large and Maud impossibly small. These stoppers were for the special barrels, the ones that must be sealed tight against prying hands and thirsty mouths when the hour grew too late. She kept them not for the coin, but for the tradition, the quiet sense that some things must remain untouched until the proper moment. Closing the tin, she looked up to find Oswin watching her, his eyes full of questions unspoken. "You think the new cask will last the week?" he asked softly. Maud's lips curved into a wry smile. "Depends who comes through that door. Some nights, one barrel's enough for all and more. Other nights, well, folk bring thirsts they didn't know they had." She slid the tin back onto its shelf, her fingers lingering a moment on the brass key. Then she rose, straightened her apron, and leaned against the bar to watch as Elric wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands now stained with the sweet damp of fresh oak. In that stillness, the Greenheart Tavern felt like the heart of a much larger world, a beating place where rivers met roads, where barrels bore secrets on their broad wooden backs, where folk who never lingered anywhere else stayed just long enough to leave a story behind. Outside, the wind rose and fell like a distant wave, and somewhere far beyond the shuttered windows, a cart creaked along a muddy lane, carrying yet another barrel toward yet another hearth. And inside, the tavern waited, patient, warm, and ready for whatever thirst the night might yet bring. By the time the first threads of dawn began to unravel the night's dark weave, the Greenheart Tavern had settled into its deepest hush. Only the faintest glow seeped beneath the heavy door, hinting at a sky bruised purple and pearl above the slumbering village. Inside, Maud moved like a ghost among shadows, her soft-soled shoes silent on the ancient planks as she checked the locks, drew the shutters closer, and listened for the secret murmurs that only a tavern keeper knows. The last of the evening's guests had drifted away hours before, some weaving gently down the lane toward cottages wreathed in chimney smoke, others bound for barns and haylofts, carrying with them the warmth of ale and the echoes of old songs. Only Oswin remained, slumped in a chair near the hearth, his chin resting on his chest, breath steady and deep. He had meant to keep watch over the new barrel, but weariness had claimed him before his promise could. Maud let him sleep. There was no harm in it. A man who has given his life to tending barrels and binding the frayed edges of strangers' tales deserved the grace of rest when it found him. She stepped past him, pausing by the barrel of White Gull ale they had settled the night before. She touched its damp stave lightly, as though greeting an old friend who had crossed miles to find her. Beside it, Elric dozed too, curled like a cat on a pile of burlap sacks. His hair spilled across his brow in a wild tangle, a boy's dreams drifting far beyond the tavern walls. Maud studied him for a moment, this youth on the cusp of becoming something more, something larger than the hollow where he liked to hide, something sturdier than the barrels he admired. She smiled to herself, then moved away, her mind turning to the ledgers tucked in the small room behind the bar. There were numbers to tally, kegs to note, coins to count, debts to mark in the margins. But the ledgers could wait a breath longer. Instead, Maud crossed the taproom to a narrow door that led to the cold cellar, pushing it open with her hip. A wave of cool air sighed up the stairs, carrying the scent of earth, stone, and resting barrels. She stepped down carefully, lantern held before her. The flame cast trembling shadows on the low ceiling, illuminating row upon row of casks stacked like sleepy giants. Some bore the marks of local cooperatives, simple initials, rough sigils scratched in haste, while others gleamed with copper hoops and foreign symbols that spoke of rivers crossed, borders breached, smugglers bribed, and customs men outwitted. Maud paused before the oldest barrel, tucked in the farthest corner where the damp stones met the deeper dark. This one had sat so long that a thin veil of mold dusted its head like a crown of frost. She bent, brushing the barrel side with her thumb, uncovering the faint swirl of a mark, a fox leaping over a moon. A sign she knew well, though she had not spoken of it in years. It was her father's mark, a cooper's sign older than her own name. He had built this cask with his own hands, long before he traded wood for the warmth of a hearth and the laughter of strangers. In her childhood, Maud had heard him say that the first barrel a cooper crafted held more than ale. It held a promise, binding him to the work and the work to him, as sure as any priest's blessing. Maud pressed her palm flat against the wood and closed her eyes. She could almost hear her father's voice, rough, gentle, carrying the faint echo of sea salt winds from when he had sailed with barrels just like this one lashed to the deck, braving storms and salt spray and the creak of timbers strained near breaking. "I've kept it safe," she whispered to the barrel, her words no louder than the drip of water seeping through old stone. "I've kept it safe, just as you asked." The barrel did not answer, of course. It never had. But in its silence, Maud found a comfort deeper than any ledger's neat sum. She touched the iron hoop, felt the chill bite her skin, then pulled her hand away. Upstairs, a faint creak announced Oswin stirring awake, the chair legs scraping the flagstone. Maud climbed the steps once more, closing the cellar door behind her as dawn spilled a silver wash across the shuttered windows. She found Oswin rubbing sleep from his eyes, blinking blearily at the dying coals. "Best sleep I've had in weeks," he muttered, a sheepish grin stealing across his beard. Maud only shook her head, amused, and reached for a cloth to wipe down the bar. Elric stirred next, his yawn loud in the hush. He sat up, hair a mess, eyes bright with the shock of new day. "Is it time?" he asked, looking past Maud to the white gull barrel, his voice cracking just slightly with the weight of sleep. "It is," Maud said. "Fetch the tap. Oswin, you watch his hand. One slip and he'll wear more ale than he'll serve." Together they moved like a quiet ritual. Oswin fetched the brass tap from its peg behind the bar, while Elric set his small hammer ready. Maud leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching them with the patient fondness of a gardener watching saplings reach for the sun. Elric positioned the spile with a trembling care, setting it just so against the bung. He looked at Oswin, who gave him the smallest nod. Then, with a breath held in his lungs like a prayer, Elric struck. Once. Twice. The spile sank home with a satisfying thunk, and for a heartbeat the world was still. Then came the gentle hiss, the soft promise that the ale would flow soon enough. A smile broke across Elric's face, pure and bright as sunrise through mist. Maud let herself smile too, her fingers drumming softly on the wood of the bar. "Good," she said. "Now draw the first measure. Let's see if the sea truly followed this barrel all the way here." As Elric fetched a clean tankard, Oswin leaned closer to Maud, his voice pitched low. "Do you ever think of leaving? Taking the road like these barrels do? Going somewhere the river calls?" Maud did not answer at once. She watched Elric tilt the tap, watched the first amber trickle fill the cup, watched the new day unfurl itself through her tavern's old bones. "When the time comes," she said at last, her voice soft as the hush before dawn, "I'll know which barrel to follow." And with that, the green heart breathed in the dawn, its walls holding secrets, its barrels holding promises, and its people holding the hush of something not yet spoken but surely waiting, just beyond the next open door. Morning at the Greenheart Tavern did not burst forth like trumpets at a king's gate, but rather unfolded in a hush, as if the dawn itself were a guest too shy to knock. Outside, the lane glistened with last night's mist, the thatch roofs of the village cottages dripping slow jewels into the grass. A lone cockerel crowed half-heartedly from somewhere beyond the hedgerows. His voice carried on the mild breeze that promised a day neither too warm nor too cold. Within the tavern, the first rays of sunlight seeped through the narrow cracks in the shutters, tracing pale lines across the scuffed tabletops and the well-worn grain of the bar. In this new light, the white gull barrel gleamed where it sat near the hearth, a squat sentinel of the coast, its iron hoops catching the glow as if to remind all who entered that salt winds and distant harbors lingered still in its staves. Elric cradled the first tankard of the dawn's pour, lifting it to his nose as though he might read the ocean's secrets in the rising curl of foam. He held it out to Maud with careful hands. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his, rough with scrubbing but still tender, the way young hands ought to be. She took a sip, let it sit on her tongue, tasting the ghost of salt air, the whisper of brine tangled with barley and hops. The ale had a crisp bite that reminded her of mornings spent on rocky shores long before the tavern was hers, when she'd stood beside her father as he spoke to fishermen whose nets brimmed with silver fish and stories of storms survived. "Good," she said at last, her voice low but carrying. "It'll hold its own." Elric exhaled a laugh of relief, glancing over his shoulder at Oswin, who stood with arms folded across his chest, looking for all the world as if he'd had any doubt. Oswin only grunted and reached for his own tankard, drawing it full with the steady hand of a man who knew how not to waste a drop. The door creaked open then, just a fraction at first, letting a blade of morning in. Through it stepped the first customer of the day, a girl no older than Elric, a woven basket on her hip, the smell of wildflowers clinging to her cloak. She paused just inside, blinking at the warmth, the hush, the way the tavern seemed both older than time and yet forever young in the first breath of day. Maud lifted her chin in greeting. "What brings you so early, Mara?" The girl's voice was soft, shy as new milk. "My mother sends the butter, Mistress Maud. She says the barrels will be thirsty work this week." She lifted the basket and Maud stepped forward, peering inside. Neatly wrapped pats of pale yellow butter nestled among sprigs of fresh herbs. Maud plucked one out, turned it in her hands, and nodded with a hum of approval. "Your mother's butter's worth more than gold when the hearth grows warm," she said, her smile kind but edged with the briskness of one who never let sentiment slow the morning's tasks. "Leave it in the cold cellar, girl, and take a heel of bread from the kitchen for your trouble." Mara bobbed her head and slipped past Elric, her eyes flicking curiously at the barrels, as though she half expected them to speak. Elric watched her go, some thought dancing behind his sleep-bright gaze, but he said nothing, turning instead to rinse the tap clean and polish the spile. Oswin leaned closer to Maud, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "That lad's got his eyes on every road that passes this place. If you're not careful, he'll follow one before long." Maud said nothing, only took another measured sip of the sea-born ale. She felt the salt on her lips, the warmth in her chest, a warmth that pushed back against the small ache that came from knowing things must change to stay alive. Beyond the bar, more footsteps gathered, a pair of farmhands with mud still caked to their boots, an old shepherd whose stick tapped gently on the threshold, a peddler who had slept in his cart beneath the sycamore, blinking awake now with the prospect of a warm drink. They drifted in like threads spun loose from the world outside, weaving themselves back into the hearth's gentle circle. Elric moved among them, shy but eager, tankard in hand, learning when to speak, when to listen, when to laugh. The white gull barrel hissed its soft promise with each pour. "Taste the salt, remember the sea, carry it within you even here, far from any shore." Maud caught his eye once as he passed her, his hands sticky with foam, his hair haloed by the sun that now broke full across the taproom. She saw him as he was, a boy yet, but with the makings of a man who might one day stand at a dockside tavern of his own, rolling barrels ashore and watching ships slip beyond the horizon. Oswin leaned against the hearth, his eyes closing in contentment, his breath steady with the rhythm of old wood and older tales. The green heart itself seemed to sigh in its beams and stones, pleased with the day, with the barrel that had come so far to rest here, with the people who gave it purpose beyond drink alone. And outside, the road waited, rutted and muddy, silvered by the morning, carrying rumors of new barrels yet to come, new stories yet to find a hearth, new souls to gather in the hush before the next dawn. And within, the green heart kept its promise, as it always had, to be a haven for thirst, for laughter, for secrets told in the soft spill of ale over oak, for the small courage found at the bottom of a tankard, and for the quiet hope that when the barrel runs dry, another waits somewhere down the road, brimming with the sea's memory and the promise of return.